Maybe you've heard 100 stories about the Knights Templar. Movies, novels, conspiracy theories, they're everywhere. But the truth behind the legends is far more astonishing than most people realize. For more than 2 centuries, from just 9 poor knights in Jerusalem, they rose into a force that held power, gold, and secrets the Pope himself feared. And then, in one autumn night in 1307, it all seemed to vanish. Or at least, that's what the surface shows. What remains are scattered traces in Vatican archives, faded maps, and whispered legends passed down through the centuries, all suggesting that the Templar story didn't really end at the flames that consumed Jacques de Molay. Tonight, we'll piece those fragments back together, not chasing cheap thrills, but uncovering what official history chose to leave out. Where are you listening from? The United States, Europe, maybe Asia? Drop a comment. I find it incredible that across time and distance, we're connected here, sharing a secret that once only a few dared to speak. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. Doesn't sound like the kind of name you'd expect for one of the most powerful orders in history, right? Just a handful of men, maybe 9 at most, standing in the dusty streets of Jerusalem around the year 1119. They weren't kings, they weren't rich, and they certainly weren't famous. They were just knights who said their mission was simple: to protect pilgrims on the road to the Holy Land. Now think about that for a second. 9 men against bandits, mercenaries, and the constant chaos of the crusader states. That's not really protection, that's suicide. And yet somehow, within a single generation, these same knights would go from sleeping in borrowed quarters to becoming Europe's most feared and admired brotherhood. So what happened in between? This is where the story stops sounding like a clean line of history and starts feeling more like a riddle. Because those first years are almost blank. No records, no real chronicles, just whispers. And in history, when you see a silence like that, you know something important is being covered, or forgotten, or maybe both. Here's what we do know. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave them a place to stay, not just anywhere, but on the Temple Mount itself. That's the ruins of Solomon's Temple, the most sacred ground in the Old Testament. And for 9 years, the knights didn't act like bodyguards on the road. They dug, they tunneled, they searched. So the question becomes, what were they really looking for under the stones of the old temple? Relics, gold, or knowledge that was never meant to come out into daylight? This is where the legend of the Templars really begins. Not with swords raised in battle, but with shovels scraping in the dust, and secrets buried deep under centuries of rubble. And if you lean in close enough, you can almost feel it. The hum of something they found down there. Something that would change the destiny of the order forever. The digging on the Temple Mount is more than just a footnote. It's the first shadow that falls over the Templars, the moment where the official story and the hidden one split. To the pilgrims outside the city walls, the knights were a curiosity. Quiet men in white mantles, keeping watch. But under the ground, the real work was happening. 9 years of digging. That's not a side project. That's an obsession. Medieval chroniclers didn't even bother to explain it, but later legends would not stay quiet. Some claimed they were searching for the Ark of the Covenant, the chest that once carried the presence of God himself. Others whispered about scrolls, secret texts hidden when Jerusalem first fell to the Babylonians. Knowledge so dangerous, it had been sealed away for centuries. There's even a story that they uncovered a network of tunnels, older than the city itself, carved with symbols no one could read. Whether or not any of that is true, one fact remains. When the Templars emerged from those 9 silent years, they were not the same humble knights who had gone in. Suddenly, they had the support of the most powerful men in Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux, the spiritual giant of the age, began speaking their praises. Popes signed charters that freed them from kings, bishops, and even taxes. And in a world where freedom was rare, the Templars now answered only to the Pope himself. That kind of leap doesn't happen by accident. You don't go from obscurity to international power in a single generation without something extraordinary behind it. Maybe it was the favor of the Church. Maybe it was the treasures they found in those tunnels. Or maybe, and this is the part that makes history lean in closer, it was both. Because from that moment on, the Templars weren't just another military order. They were untouchable. They moved across Europe like a tide, setting up commanderies, gaining lands, and building the kind of influence that frightened both kings and bishops alike. And yet, behind the bright banners and the solemn oaths, the question lingered. What had they found beneath the temple, and why did it make them so indispensable to the Vatican? That question, hanging in the silence, is what gives their story its weight. And it's the silence we'll keep chasing, because the Templars were not just soldiers. They were guardians of something more. Something the world still hasn't fully named. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had become a force you couldn't ignore. They weren't just patrolling dusty roads in the Holy Land anymore. They were woven into the fabric of Christendom itself. Imagine Europe at that time. Peasants tilling fields under the shadow of castles, lords constantly at war with one another, and kings scrambling for money to fund their endless campaigns. Into that chaos stepped the Templars, offering something no one else could provide: stability. They created a system that looked almost modern. A nobleman could leave his lands behind, ride east to fight in the Crusades, and deposit his wealth with the Templars for safekeeping. In return, he received a written note, a kind of medieval check. Travel hundreds of miles to another Templar house, and that same piece of parchment could release funds again. It was the birth of international banking, centuries before the word even existed. Pilgrims used it too. Imagine being a poor merchant from Paris, terrified of being robbed on the long road to Jerusalem. You hand your coins to the Templars in France, and weeks later, you walk into a fortress in Acre and collect your money safely. No highwayman can take what you never carry. This is where the order's power shifted. They weren't just warriors with swords. They were warriors with ledgers. Castles doubled as treasuries. Chapels doubled as vaults. And while kings constantly found themselves broke, the Templars seemed to grow only richer with every passing year. But power attracts suspicion. Whispers spread that the knights had secrets locked away, not just gold. People noticed how their rituals took place behind closed doors, how even their lowest-ranking sergeants were bound to silence. And when ordinary people can't see what's inside, they fill the gaps with fear. Were the Templars guarding treasure from beneath the Temple Mount, sacred relics, or forbidden texts that challenged the Church itself? The irony is sharp. An order born to protect pilgrims now frightened the very world it claimed to serve. And yet, their prestige only grew. Cathedrals gave them chapels, kings begged for their loans, and the Pope himself held them close as his personal militia. The white mantles with the red cross became a symbol not just of faith, but of a strange kind of independence. They owed loyalty to no king, no bishop, no law but Rome. That freedom was intoxicating and dangerous. And so the question deepened. If the Templars had indeed uncovered something beneath the temple, was this new independence the price they demanded for keeping it hidden? By the time the 13th century dawned, the Templars had become more than soldiers or bankers. They were a mystery carved into stone and sealed in wax. Picture their fortresses, not just castles, but near impenetrable machines of defense. Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, with its concentric walls and secret wells, could withstand sieges that crushed ordinary armies. These strongholds dotted the trade routes like beacons, safe harbors for pilgrims, treasuries for kings, and, some whispered, libraries for forbidden knowledge. In Europe, their houses became just as formidable. The temple in Paris, their headquarters, rose with thick stone walls and a keep that dwarfed the city around it. Beneath its floors lay vaults where kings themselves stored their treasure. Imagine that reversal. A monarch handing his wealth not to his court, but to a band of warrior monks who answered to no crown. The order had created a network so vast, it blurred the line between sacred and secular. Their chapels echoed with Latin prayers, while their halls echoed with the clink of coins and the scratching of quills on parchment. They moved effortlessly between worlds, the battlefield and the marketplace, the cloister and the throne room. And yet, the more they rose, the more the question returned. What lay at the center of their power? The official story said discipline, faith, and clever administration. But stories passed from pilgrim to pilgrim told something else, that in the darkness beneath the Temple of Solomon, the knights had found more than relics. Some said they unearthed the Ark of the Covenant, its presence explaining their sudden surge of influence. Others believed it was manuscripts, ancient scrolls that told of a Christ not bound by Rome's authority, a bloodline that still lived. Of course, there is no proof, only fragments, whispers, and gaps in the record. But sometimes, silence is the loudest testimony of all, because the Templars themselves never spoke of it. Bound by vows of secrecy, they let the world wonder. They let kings tremble, bishops frown, and pilgrims speculate. The mystery itself became part of their arsenal, and so, as the order entered its golden age, it also stepped into the shadow of its own legend. For secrets do not stay buried forever, and the higher one climbs, the longer and darker the fall becomes. When the Templars returned from the East, they were not simply welcomed home. They were absorbed into the very fabric of Christendom, and no one understood their value more than the Pope. Think of the Church at that time. Europe was fractured by feudal wars, kings bickering like spoiled children over borders and titles. The papacy needed more than prayer to hold sway. It needed a sword that answered not to crown, but to the keys of St. Peter. That is what the Templars offered. In 1139, a papal bull declared them untouchable by secular authority. No king, no bishop, no nobleman could tax them, arrest them, or interfere with their work. They answered only to Rome. Imagine the power in that privilege, a brotherhood of armed monks, free to move across borders, carrying wealth and secrets in the name of God, and guarded by the Church's blessing. But such favor came at a price. The Vatican tied its own prestige to the order's fate. Every Templar victory was the Pope's triumph, every failure his shame. When Jerusalem was lost in 1187, it was not only a Christian kingdom that fell, but also the illusion that divine favor guaranteed success. The Templars bore the weight of that failure, and yet, paradoxically, their role grew. The more fragile the Holy Land became, the more essential the knights seemed. In Rome, whispers began. Was this alliance truly one of service or of rivalry? For while the Pope had given them authority, the Templars had built something the Church itself could not: independence. Their houses functioned like miniature states. Their chapels, though holy, were also citadels. Their rituals, though Christian, bore a secrecy that set them apart. Clerics grumbled. How could men of God take oaths in the shadows, revealing nothing even to bishops? How could they speak their own prayers, keep their own archives, answer questions with silence? The Vatican both needed and feared them. It was a marriage of convenience, holy on paper, fragile in reality. And like all marriages forged under pressure, it carried within it the seeds of betrayal. For now, however, the bond held. The Templars were the Pope's sword arm. The Vatican was their shield. Together, they appeared unbreakable. But beneath the marble floors of cathedrals and the stone walls of fortresses, cracks had already begun to form. At first, the papacy had been the Templars' greatest shield. From the early bulls of Innocent II, which declared the order answerable to no king, to the steady stream of privileges that let them cross borders free of tolls and taxes, Rome had given them a power few dared to question. But power is a double-edged sword, and in time, the Vatican began to sense that the knights it had blessed were now standing too tall in the light. By the late 13th century, the Church's vision of the Crusades had faltered. Jerusalem was lost. The Holy Land, for which the order had been created, was slipping away. And with that loss came an uncomfortable question. What purpose did the Templars serve now? In Rome, whispers grew louder. Cardinals muttered that the order was more banker than brotherhood, that their vows of poverty rang hollow while they lent to princes at interest. The Pope's own scribes noted the sheer wealth of the temple in Paris, a treasury that rivaled Rome's own. And there was something else, less tangible, more dangerous. The Templars had cultivated a mystique of secrecy. They held their own chapters in silence, admitted recruits through rituals no outsider could witness, guarded knowledge in sealed archives no bishop could open. To the Church, whose authority rested on being the keeper of divine truth, this secrecy felt like defiance. What were the Templars hiding? Was it heresy? Was it treasure? Or was it something even more subversive? A claim to spiritual authority that rivaled the Pope himself. Papal authority thrived on transparency of doctrine, on the visible hierarchy of priests and bishops. The Templars thrived on silence, discipline, and the unspoken. These two worlds, once partners, were beginning to diverge, and yet the Vatican could not simply cast them aside. The order was too popular, too respected, too entrenched in every corner of Christendom. Kings borrowed from them. Merchants trusted them. Pilgrims praised them. So Rome bided its time. But resentment has a way of festering, and envy has a way of sharpening into accusation. The stage was quietly being set for a reckoning, not in the deserts of the Holy Land, but in the palaces of Europe. And when that reckoning came, it would not be the enemies of Christendom who destroyed the Templars. It would be the hand of the Pope himself. If Rome's doubts were subtle, Paris's were not. King Philip IV of France, known even in his own time as Philip the Fair for his cold, marble-like beauty, was a monarch consumed by two things: debt and power. He had fought wars against England, against Flanders, against his own restless barons. Wars drained coffers, and by the turn of the 14th century, his kingdom bled silver faster than he could mint it. And who, across the Seine in their fortified temple, held more wealth than the king himself? The Knights Templar. Philip had borrowed heavily from them, for armor, for ships, for mercenaries. His crown jewels had been pledged as collateral more than once. To the world, the Templars looked like the king's trusted bankers. To Philip, they were creditors, and creditors were chains. But there was more at play than debt. The Templars were respected across Europe in a way that Philip never was. Their white mantles with the red cross were symbols of incorruptible faith, while whispers about Philip painted him as ruthless, manipulative, even godless. The contrast gnawed at him, and so resentment began to take shape as strategy. He filled his court with lawyers and clerks trained in canon law, men adept not with the sword, but with parchment. These were not warriors, but they were weapons all the same. Weapons sharper than steel because they could turn suspicion into heresy and debt into treason. If the Vatican questioned the Templars' secrecy, Philip would feed the doubt. If priests whispered about strange rites, he would amplify the rumor. He knew the Church had long feared movements outside its control. Cathars, Waldensians, heretics burned in southern France. The Templars, Philip reasoned, could be painted with the same brush. And while Rome still hesitated, Philip acted. He placed spies in Paris, watching who entered and left the temple. He sent agents abroad, collecting stories, however wild, of strange rituals, of whispered blasphemies. The tales grew darker with each retelling. Spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, obscene kisses at initiation. None could be proven, but none could be disproven either. In Philip's hands, rumor became weapon, and debt became motive. What had once been murmurs in the Curia now became accusations in royal courts. What had once been envy became a campaign. The stage was nearly set, and in that gathering storm, one thing became clear. The rift between the Vatican and the Templars would not simply widen, it would rupture. And when it did, it would shake Christendom to its core. The year was 1305, and the papal tiara had just been placed on the head of a man who would forever be remembered not for his strength, but for his compromise. Bertrand de Goth, a Frenchman from Gascony, became Clement V. He was no soldier pope like Urban II, no scholar saint like Gregory. Clement was careful, cautious, a man who prized survival over confrontation. And survival, in that moment, meant pleasing the most powerful monarch in Europe, King Philip IV. Philip had maneuvered him well. The papacy itself was in turmoil. Rome had been racked with riots, its noble families tearing at one another for influence. The College of Cardinals, many of them French, were all too willing to abandon the Eternal City for the safety of France. When Clement agreed to settle his court in Avignon under French shadow, it was clear to every eye in Christendom, the Pope now bent toward Paris. And bending meant listening. Philip pressed him relentlessly. The Templars, Philip said, were no longer warriors, they were bankers. They were a state within a state. They kept secrets even from the Holy See. Could the Church afford to let them stand unchallenged? Clement hesitated. The Order of the Temple had been sacred guardians of the faith for nearly 2 centuries. They had fought in every crusade, shed their blood in the sand of Jerusalem, defended pilgrims along the coast of Outremer. They answered only to the papacy itself, and now the papacy was being asked to betray them. The Pope's advisors were split. Some urged caution. The rumors of heresy were smoke without fire. Others whispered that to resist Philip was to invite disaster, to risk the fragile stability of the Church itself. And so Clement did what weak men often do when forced to choose. He delayed. He promised inquiry, not judgment. He sent letters to the masters of the Templars, asking them to explain their secret rites, their oaths, their immense fortune. He summoned Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, to France. But delay was not enough. Philip had no interest in inquiry. He wanted annihilation, and he had already begun to set the trap. As Clement wrung his hands in Avignon, in Paris the king's agents sharpened their accusations into charges, and their charges into indictments. What had begun as whispers was about to become the loudest roar in Christendom. Jacques de Molay had been Grand Master of the Knights Templar for nearly 2 decades. He was not a young man when he rode into Paris in 1307, his beard white, his posture still straight from a lifetime in armor. To him, the summons from Pope Clement was no threat. It was an opportunity. The order had faced criticism before, envy from kings, suspicion from bishops. But the Templars had always answered with dignity, with their record of service, with the sheer weight of their sacrifice. De Molay believed the same would happen again. When he entered France, he brought with him letters, records, and even gifts, relics from the East, meant to strengthen bonds with both crown and papacy. He had no sense of the shadows gathering around him. Paris in those months was a city humming with rumor, whispers of blasphemy, of idols, of rites performed in secret chapels. Merchants muttered that the Templars spat upon the cross in their initiations. Priests warned that they worshipped a demon with a bearded head. The stories multiplied with each telling, and though few believed them fully, the poison had already seeped into the air. De Molay requested an audience with Clement. He stood before the Pope in Avignon and defended his brethren with calm conviction. "Holy Father," he is said to have declared, "we have fought for Christ, bled for Christ, and died for Christ. If there are liars against us, let them stand before us openly." Clement, cautious as ever, nodded. He promised an inquiry, commissions, questions, depositions. De Molay returned to Paris, reassured. But what he did not see was the net tightening. Philip had already resolved the outcome. The charges were not to be tested, they were to be proclaimed. The Templars' vast holdings in France, their castles, their treasuries, their fertile estates, had already been counted in the king's mind as spoils. And so while Jacques de Molay still believed he was engaged in dialogue, the order was given. The king's men prepared sealed writs. Across the kingdom, sheriffs and bailiffs were instructed to act in unison, at dawn, on the same day. It would be a morning that entered history. Friday, October 13th, 1307. Paris still slept when the knock came at the temple gates. It was not the usual shuffle of pilgrims or merchants seeking loans. It was the heavy beat of mailed fists, the clatter of armed men, the bark of a royal seal being proclaimed. Inside the fortress, the Templars had no warning. They had not sharpened swords, nor prepared defenses. The knights who had bled at Acre, who had marched barefoot into the deserts of Syria, were caught in their beds or at their prayers. The writs were opened. They bore the king's command. The arrest of every Templar in France. The charge, heresy. Across the city, across the countryside, the same scene unfolded. From the towers of Champagne to the farms of Burgundy, men in white mantles with red crosses were dragged from their homes. Some resisted at first, until they saw the scale of the operation, the sheer number of soldiers who had descended at once, as though the whole kingdom had been preparing in silence for this moment. The people watched in disbelief. To them, the Templars were warriors of God, guardians of relics, bankers of princes. They had stood at the very frontier of Christendom. Now, suddenly, they were branded traitors, accused of bowing before idols, of spitting upon the cross, of worshipping demons in candlelit chambers. The irony was bitter. The very secrecy that had once protected the order, its closed initiations, its vows of silence, now gave shape to every dark rumor. What no one had ever seen was easy to imagine. In Paris, Jacques de Molay himself was seized. Only days before, he had stood as pallbearer at the funeral of Catherine, the king's sister-in-law, at Philip's invitation. He had believed he was trusted, even honored. Now he was a prisoner, shackled and accused of sins he had never confessed. The king's men moved quickly to secure what mattered most: the treasure vaults. Gold, silver, relics, and records of debts owed to the Templars were confiscated under royal authority. In that single day, Philip tightened his grip not just on the men, but on their wealth, their reputation, their power. It was Friday the 13th, and for centuries after, the date would carry the echo of this betrayal. The dungeons beneath Paris were not built for knights. They were meant for thieves, for cut-purses, for petty criminals who stole bread in the night. Yet in October of 1307, they held men who had once ridden under banners blessed by popes, who had defended Christendom's borders with steel and blood. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was locked away in cold stone. His fellow leaders, Geoffroy de Charnay, Hugues de Perrot, Geoffroy de Gonville, were separated, cut off from one another, denied the brotherhood that had sustained them for decades. Isolation was the first blade. The second was fire. The king's inquisitors came with questions already shaped into accusations. Do you deny Christ? Did you spit upon the cross? Did you worship a head, a demon, in your halls? These were not questions in search of truth. They were snares, and the only way out was to answer in the words Philip desired. Those who resisted were shown the implements: the rack, where limbs stretched beyond their sockets; the strappado, where shoulders tore beneath their weight; iron boots heated until skin blistered; ropes twisted until circulation failed. Some endured until their voices broke and silence itself became impossible. Others, half dead, signed parchments admitting to things they had never done, repeating oaths they had never sworn. Confessions spread like wildfire, carefully copied and sealed, and here is where the Vatican's role deepened. Pope Clement V, once hesitant, once cautious, found himself cornered. He could not protect the Templars without standing against Philip. And Philip had already set the narrative: heresy, satanic rites, the corruption of an order once sacred. When the Pope received the confessions, he wavered. Some were clearly forced, some contradicted others, yet they were written proof. And in that age, a written confession under seal was enough to damn even the holiest of men. The Pope ordered his own inquiry, but instead of reversing Philip's charges, it echoed them, like a shadow following too close. Whether by fear, by calculation, or by sheer inability to resist the crown, Clement's pen became the accomplice to Philip's sword. The Templars had faced the scimitars of the Saracens. Now they faced quills and parchments, and it was these, not blades, that would undo them. The news spread faster than any crusader's horse could ride. From Paris to Avignon, from the ports of Marseille to the trading houses of Venice, the arrest of the Templars shook Europe like a sudden quake. Letters carried the accusations, confessions, signed under duress, sealed with trembling hands, were read aloud in marketplaces. They spat on the cross, some proclaimed. They worshipped idols. They desecrated Christ. Words designed to rot faith from the inside. And yet, disbelief lingered. In England, King Edward II at first dismissed the charges as absurd. How could these men, who fought and bled for Christendom, now be called servants of the devil? In the Iberian kingdoms, where Templar castles still bristled against Moorish frontiers, local rulers hesitated. They had seen the order's valor with their own eyes. But the Vatican's silence, and then its hesitant agreement, carried weight. Pope Clement's inquiry sanctioned Philip's narrative, and suddenly doubt became dangerous. To question the accusations was to question both crown and papacy. Few dared. Still, the reaction was uneven. In Aragon and Portugal, the knights were quietly absorbed into new orders, renamed but not entirely destroyed. In England, arrests were delayed, softened, half-hearted. But in France, Philip's France, the process was merciless. Trials spread across dioceses, inquisitors moving from town to town, prying confessions from weary men who had once called themselves brothers. The people watched. Some whispered sympathy. They had seen Templar charity, their alms to the poor, their guardianship of roads. Others muttered suspicion. Wealth always breeds envy, and the order's estates had long stirred resentment. And in taverns and cloisters alike, the question grew louder. Were the knights truly guilty? Or was something darker moving beneath the surface, a struggle for power dressed in the garments of faith? By the end of 1308, the rift between perception and reality had grown vast. On parchment, the Templars were heretics. In the hearts of many, they remained heroes. But the machinery of their destruction had already been set in motion, and once gears of politics began to turn, they rarely stopped for truth. Clement V was no tyrant. Unlike Philip, whose hunger for power was naked and unashamed, the Pope was a man bound by caution, calculation, and the ever-present fear of what history would say of him. He had ascended to the papal throne under uneasy circumstances. His seat moved from Rome to Avignon, a compromise that already made him look like Philip's shadow. Every decision, every word, carried the weight of scrutiny. Was he shepherd of Christendom, or puppet of the French king? When the Templars were seized in 1307, Clement's first reaction was outrage, not for the knights, but for the violation of papal authority. These men, sworn to Rome, had been arrested without his consent. A king had acted where only the Pope should. It was a wound to the dignity of the Church itself. And yet Philip knew how to tighten the net. He sent reports of the confessions, lurid with blasphemy. He dispatched envoys to whisper of idols kissed in secret, of rituals held in torchlit halls. And he placed a heavier weapon still on the table. The suggestion that if Clement resisted, Philip might push for a council to replace him entirely. The Pope hesitated. He wrote letters calling the accusations hasty, demanding the knights be placed under church jurisdiction. But he also ordered inquiries of his own, summoning inquisitors to gather evidence. The balance he sought, justice for the order, protection of papal dignity, appeasement of Philip, was fragile, perhaps impossible. Meanwhile, the brothers languished in prisons. Some clung to silence, others broke under torture, giving the words their captors wanted. For every denial, there was a confession extracted by pain, and for Clement, each contradictory testimony deepened his paralysis. He feared condemning the innocent. He feared defending the guilty. But most of all, he feared the consequences of defiance, the wrath of a king who had already shown he could bend the papacy to his will. Thus the Pope wavered, issuing bulls that both rebuked Philip and confirmed his trials, letters that condemned torture but accepted its fruits. The result was confusion, not clarity, and in confusion, Philip's will prevailed. By 1309, the machinery of inquiry bore Clement's seal as well as Philip's sword. And once the papacy itself had entered the trial, there was no path for the Templars but downward. The hesitation of one man had become the betrayal of an entire order. What began in France did not stay in France. The papacy, pressured into legitimizing the process, issued instructions to kings and bishops across Christendom. Investigate the order of the temple. Do not shield them. Do not delay. Every realm was to open its prisons, gather its inquisitors, and test the knights' loyalty to Christ. In England, the order's estates stretched across fertile lands, their revenues a steady stream of coin for the crown. King Edward II, young and less hardened than Philip, initially scoffed at the accusations. The Templars had fought beside his father, defended the coasts, built churches and hospitals. He resisted the calls for arrest, questioning the plausibility of heresy whispered in dark rooms. But papal letters are heavy things, and political debts heavier still. By early 1308, even in London, the temple's gates were forced open. Some brothers were taken gently, with apologies from sheriffs who had once dined with them. Others were dragged in chains, bewildered, still swearing they had done no wrong but serve God and the crown. In the Iberian kingdoms, the response was fractured. In Aragon, the Templars barricaded themselves in castles perched high on cliffs, flying their red cross defiantly against the sky. Local lords hesitated to storm them. The knights were too skilled, too entrenched. In Portugal, King Denis resisted outright dissolution, recognizing their military value in a land still fighting Moorish strongholds. Instead, he schemed for transformation rather than destruction, planting the seeds of the future order of Christ. Germany, Italy, and beyond saw less violence but more suspicion. Trials were held, testimonies collected, but in many places the confessions sounded thin, half-believed even by the scribes recording them. Still, the fact of accusation stained the order like ink spilled across a page, blotches that could not be erased. And all the while, rumors multiplied. Were the knights really worshipping an idol's head, a bearded face carved in stone? Had they spat on the cross, denied Christ in secret rites? Each story grew in the telling, for gossip thrives where truth falters. Across Europe, the image of the once proud warrior monks began to fracture. To some, they remained holy defenders unjustly crushed by envy. To others, they became symbols of corruption, too rich, too proud, too secretive to survive in the light. The echo of Philip's blow in Paris had become a chorus across Christendom. But each echo was slightly different, shaped by the politics of the realm, by the ambitions of kings who weighed the Templars' guilt less by evidence than by the weight of their estates. The fate of the order was no longer a French affair. It had become a European reckoning. In England, the story turned strangely hollow. Edward II never shared Philip's personal hatred of the Templars, nor did he crave their wealth in the same desperate way. When the papal bulls arrived, demanding arrests, he hesitated, delaying, questioning, even writing back to Avignon that the charges seemed improbable and detestable. But pressure from Rome grew heavier, and his counselors reminded him that to resist the papacy would be political folly. So in January of 1308, sheriffs finally knocked at the doors of temple houses. The arrests were not bloody. In many cases, brothers were politely escorted to local jails, still allowed to wear their habits, still praying their offices. Yet once interrogations began, the same pattern emerged. Subtle threats, the shadow of torture, the demand to confess to things the knights swore they had never done. A few bent under pressure, but most denied, stubbornly repeating the same words. We are innocent, we are loyal, we are Christian. Across the Channel, in Aragon, the situation was far sharper. The crown there valued the Templars as frontline defenders against Muslim emirates to the south. When Philip's accusations crossed the Pyrenees, Aragonese nobles balked. They knew these knights personally. They had fought beside them, bled beside them. When orders came to arrest them, many local commanders refused. Instead, Templar castles in Aragon became islands of resistance. Great fortresses like Miravet and Monzon braced themselves for siege, banners with the Red Cross unfurled. The sieges dragged on for years, long enough that even common people whispered that perhaps the knights carried divine protection. It was not until 1309 and beyond that Aragonese forces, with considerable reluctance, began to breach these redoubts one by one. Portugal was different still. King Denis was shrewd, cautious, and deeply pragmatic. He did not want war with Rome, nor did he want to lose some of the finest warriors in his kingdom. So, while trials went through the motions, Denis quietly worked on an audacious plan. He would simply rename the order. By 1319, with papal approval, the Order of Christ was born, inheriting Templar estates and much of their brotherhood. Far from annihilation, the knights in Portugal slipped into a new life, hidden in plain sight, carrying their traditions beneath a fresh coat of paint. These fractured responses meant that the Templars' fate was never truly uniform. In France, they were crushed and humiliated. In England, they withered under suspicion, fading quietly. In Aragon, they fought to the last stone of their castles. In Portugal, they transformed, like water flowing into a new vessel. And in every land, whispers remained. For those who sympathized, the trials were nothing but the envy of kings. For those who distrusted, they were confirmation of long-held suspicions. But the true danger for the Templars was not just the rack or the gallows. It was forgetfulness. To survive, they would need memory, myth, and secrecy, and those would spread faster than any papal bull. When the papal decree finally dissolved the Order of the Temple in 1312, the ink dried, but the story did not end. In fact, it was only beginning to take on a second life, one written not in official records, but in whispers, legends, and half-believed rumors. Because while Philip IV had succeeded in breaking the order within France, the world beyond his reach was far less tidy. People saw fragments, Templar castles standing abandoned, estates changing hands, brothers quietly disappearing. And when a sudden silence follows centuries of prominence, the imagination rushes in to fill the void. In Scotland, legend says, that void was filled in the smoke of battle. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce faced the armies of England. Outnumbered, pressed, his lines trembling, he seemed destined for defeat. But in later chronicles, a strange tale appears, that a band of mounted knights, dressed in white mantles with red crosses, appeared suddenly on the battlefield, charging with such ferocity that the English lines buckled. To the Scots, it was providence. To the English, it was panic. To later storytellers, it was proof. The Templars had survived, slipping into Scotland, where papal authority held no sway, and there they had offered their swords to a king desperate for allies. Historians hesitate over the claim, pointing out that chroniclers closest to the event mention no such apparition. Yet the absence of evidence never killed a good legend, and Scotland, with its rugged hills and its resistance to both papal and royal interference, made the perfect canvas on which to paint a story of survival. Beyond Scotland, other rumors spread like vines. In Germany, chronicles spoke of Templars blending into other knightly orders, their symbols hidden beneath new coats of arms. In Switzerland, where rugged valleys defied central authority, villagers whispered that the strange discipline and wealth of certain communities owed itself to fugitive Templars who had taught them to organize and resist. And farther still, across the seas, the most tantalizing story emerged. The Templar ships had slipped away from La Rochelle before Philip's men could seize them. Some said they went west, carrying treasure, relics, or knowledge to lands unknown. Others insisted they made for Portugal or even Iceland. The truth was less important than the possibility, for the very uncertainty was fertile soil for imagination. What gave these legends such longevity was not just mystery, but desire. People wanted the Templars to survive. To peasants, they were champions wrongfully condemned. To nobles, they were reminders of a nobler chivalry untainted by greed. To enemies of France, they were martyrs of injustice. Each group reshaped the order into what it needed most: a symbol, a story, a weapon against forgetting. And so the myth of survival was born. Out of ruins, flames, and silence, the Order of the Temple transformed into something greater than itself. No longer bound to fortresses or battlefields, it became a story passed from mouth to mouth, campfire to campfire, and like all powerful stories, it would not fade. The whispers of survival did not remain whispers for long. Over the centuries, they thickened into entire webs of speculation, drawing the Templars into conspiracies and secret traditions that spanned continents. What began as folk tales of fugitive knights soon hardened into a belief that the order had not only survived, but endured in hidden form, shaping the world from the shadows. By the 17th and 18th centuries, as Europe underwent its Enlightenment, the Templars re-emerged in the imagination of new societies seeking ancient roots. Freemasonry, itself a blend of medieval craft traditions and Enlightenment ideals, became the most prominent heir to Templar myth. Masonic rituals, with their cloaked initiations, sacred symbols, and vows of brotherhood, seemed like a natural vessel for the echoes of a vanished order. And so the story took hold, that Masonry preserved not just the memory, but the lineage of the Knights of the Temple. Pamphlets and pseudo-histories began to circulate, claiming that Templar survivors had fled to Scotland after 1312, where they safeguarded their rituals until the Masonic lodges could revive them centuries later. To the public, this idea was irresistible. It offered continuity, a golden thread running unbroken from the Crusades to the Enlightenment, from swords to compasses, from castles to lodges. But the myth did not stop with Freemasonry. Across Europe, dozens of societies, Rosicrucians, Illuminists, even certain chivalric orders revived by monarchs, sought to attach themselves to the Templar name. Each claimed a fragment of the vanished order's inheritance: secret knowledge of the temple in Jerusalem, hidden relics spirited out of France, even esoteric wisdom that predated Christianity itself. And as with all powerful myths, the Templars began to take on meanings far beyond what their medieval founders could ever have imagined. To revolutionaries, they became symbols of resistance to tyranny, men who had stood against a corrupt crown and a pliant pope. To monarchs, ironically, they became models of loyalty and service, proof that the throne could inspire devotion. To romantics, they were tragic heroes, martyrs of purity destroyed by jealousy. The Vatican, for its part, watched uneasily. Though the Church had formally dissolved the order, it found itself confronted with their ghost at every turn. on banners carried by rebels, in the speeches of philosophers, in lodges where men swore oaths beneath the cross of the temple. It was as though the very act of trying to erase the Templars had given them a second life, one that no papal decree could contain. By the time the modern age dawned, the Knights Templar were less a medieval military order and more a canvas on which each generation painted its fears, hopes, and secret desires. And the deeper one looked, the more the myth seemed to twist and multiply, like roots spreading underground. The story of survival was never about whether the Templars really lived on in flesh and blood. It was about what people needed them to be: survivors, protectors, rebels, keepers of hidden truths, symbols of what was lost and what might still be waiting to be found. No story of the Templars could be complete without the gold, or at least the idea of it. When the order was dissolved in 1312, it was not only the knights who vanished. So too did their immense wealth. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had managed Europe's banking network. They held deposits for kings, guarded the dowries of queens, and financed crusades with sums that dwarfed entire kingdoms' annual revenues. Yet when Philip IV's men stormed the Paris Temple in October 1307, they found little more than a handful of coins, some ceremonial items, and empty strongboxes. It was as if the treasure had slipped away the night before. The absence was almost more dangerous than discovery. Where had the wealth gone? Did the knights scatter it across Europe in secret vaults? Did ships slip out of La Rochelle, sails billowing against the Atlantic, carrying gold toward Scotland or even beyond? Some whispered of treasure trains bound for Portugal, the one kingdom bold enough to shelter fugitive knights. Others claimed the loot never left France at all, but lay buried beneath Paris, hidden in labyrinthine tunnels the Templars had dug under their commandery. Over time, these whispers hardened into full-fledged legends. Chroniclers described convoys of wagons disappearing into the forest, ships vanishing over the horizon, and secret caches guarded by passwords only the initiated would ever know. The stories grew more extravagant with each telling, until the treasure was said to include not just gold and jewels, but holy relics, the Ark of the Covenant, fragments of the true cross, and above all, the Grail itself. It hardly mattered that no record proved such relics had ever been in the Templars' possession. Myth thrives on silence, and the silence of their missing fortune was deafening. By the 16th and 17th centuries, treasure maps began to appear, scrawled with coded markings and cryptic references to the temple hoard. In France, peasants swore that entire hills concealed caverns of Templar gold. In Scotland, stories linked the hoard to Rosslyn Chapel, its ornate carvings said to conceal both the location and the meaning of what the knights had hidden. In Portugal, the order's successor, renamed the Knights of Christ, was whispered to guard secrets carried across the ocean, fueling voyages that would redraw the world. But what gave the treasure myth its lasting power was not greed, it was mystery. It became a symbol not of what the Templars had owned, but of what they had known. The hoard was less a pile of coins and more a metaphor for hidden knowledge, sacred truths so dangerous they had to be spirited away when the church turned against them. The longer the treasure remained unfound, the more it transformed from wealth into wisdom, from gold to gospel, from coins to secrets. And each generation retold the story in its own way, layering new hopes and fears onto the mystery. The Vatican had erased the order from the ledger of history, but the silence where their treasure should have been, that silence spoke louder than any papal bull. When we speak of the missing Templar treasure, one image rises above all others: the Holy Grail. It is the chalice of Christ, the vessel of divine blood, the object of countless quests. But it was not always part of the Templar story. The Grail belonged first to medieval romance, to troubadours and poets weaving tales for noble courts. Only later did it become tangled in the legend of the knights. The bridge between treasure and Grail was silence. The Templars left behind no confession, no open record of their wealth. Into that silence poured imagination. If the order had truly possessed relics, what could be greater than the Grail itself? Knights sworn to guard Christ's legacy would, of course, be the perfect custodians of such a relic. And when they fell, of course the Grail would vanish with them. The Grail gave shape to what might otherwise have been an empty story. Instead of wagons of gold clattering through the night, the myth offered a sacred object too holy to be weighed. Instead of missing treasure, it became hidden truth. The Grail was not merely wealth, it was meaning. Writers in the centuries after 1307 drew the two threads together. They described knights sailing from La Rochelle with not just coin, but sacred cargo. They imagined secret rites, where the Grail was placed upon a stone altar and lit by flickering torches, guarded by brothers who vowed to die rather than reveal its location. They mapped the Grail's journey onto Europe's geography, hidden in Portugal, buried in Rosslyn, smuggled to the Pyrenees, or even carried across the Atlantic to the New World. The Vatican itself, by condemning the Templars with such ferocity, helped fertilize this myth. Why destroy the order so thoroughly if they had only been guilty of corruption? Why burn Jacques de Molay if there was nothing more dangerous than greed at stake? Silence again became the soil of suspicion, and suspicion demanded a relic to justify it. By the 19th century, the Grail and the treasure had become inseparable. Romantics, Freemasons, and occultists treated the Templars as keepers of secret wisdom. Writers suggested the Grail was not a cup at all, but a bloodline, a sacred text, a hidden teaching smuggled out under cover of night. Some went further. They claimed the Grail was the treasure, that it was knowledge, not gold, which Philip IV and Clement V had tried to seize. And so, what began as an empty strongbox in Paris became one of the most enduring mysteries in Western imagination. The treasure that had never been found was transformed into the Grail that could never be possessed. It is in this transformation that the Templars gained their second life, not as bankers or soldiers, but as keepers of secrets. And it is here, in the myths of Grail and treasure, that their shadow stretched far beyond their own destruction. By the time Europe staggered into the 18th century, the Templars had been gone for nearly 500 years. Their castles were crumbling into ivy and dust. Their names survived in parchment and in the faint tracery of crosses carved into old stones. Yet in the lodges of a rising movement, the Freemasons, the Knights, were being reborn. Freemasonry began as a guild tradition, the brotherhood of builders who had shaped cathedrals and palaces. But in the age of Enlightenment, those guilds transformed into something else, societies of ritual, philosophy, and symbolism. Men from across Europe gathered in candlelit halls, beneath vaulted ceilings or hidden basements, to rehearse ceremonies heavy with allegory. They sought not only fellowship, but also the secrets of human destiny. It was here, amid compasses and squares, that whispers of the Templars resurfaced. Some lodges began to claim that they were not merely descendants of medieval stonemasons, but heirs of the Knights Templar themselves. Their rituals were infused with Templar imagery, red crosses, swords drawn in oaths, the invocation of Jerusalem as a mystical city. Why the Templars? because they offered a story of martyrdom, of secrecy, and of forbidden knowledge. To men already drawn to allegory and hidden truths, the idea that the Templars had preserved some great mystery, destroyed by kings, suppressed by popes, was irresistible. By the mid-1700s, elaborate Templar degrees appeared in Masonic rites. Initiates were led through darkened rooms, confronted with skulls and swords, told of Jacques de Molay's burning, and sworn to continue the Brotherhood's sacred work. In Scotland, France, and Germany, entire branches of Freemasonry styled themselves as direct continuations of the order. Some even claimed that fugitive knights had crossed the sea to Scotland in 1307, sheltering under Robert the Bruce, and carrying their secrets into the foundations of the craft. Outside the lodges, conspiracy took root. If Masons were Templars reborn, what knowledge did they guard? What power had they inherited? Rumors swelled that the Grail was hidden in their vaults, that they plotted new crusades in secret, that they preserved not just ritual but heresy. The Templars' fall, it seemed, had given birth to a myth too compelling to die. Freemasonry's link to the Templars may never have been more than symbolic, a marriage of romance and ritual. But in the public imagination, the two fused together. The Templars, destroyed in fire, found new life in candlelight. And this rebirth had consequences. For kings and churches still wary of secret societies, it meant that the ghost of the Templars had returned, not in armor, but in allegory. Once again, the Vatican looked on with suspicion. Once again, the name of the Templars became bound to fears of hidden oaths and forbidden power. What the world did not yet know was that this new incarnation of the Templar myth would spread far beyond Europe, crossing oceans, shaping revolutions, and breathing new life into the legend of the poor knights who had once sworn vows of poverty in Jerusalem. The autumn winds that pushed sails westward carried not only settlers and soldiers, but also stories. By the time the 17th and 18th centuries opened, the legend of the Knights Templar had traveled across the Atlantic. In taverns along the harbors of Boston, in the secret chambers of colonial lodges, and in the imaginations of men charting a new republic, the Templars lived again. Freemasonry, already thick with Templar imagery in Europe, found fertile ground in the colonies. The young men of America, lawyers, printers, merchants, were drawn to the ritual and symbolism of the lodges. And there, cloaked in allegory, the ghost of the Templars was welcomed as an ancestor. Some of the founding fathers themselves became Masons, and whether they truly believed they were heirs to a medieval order or simply borrowed its symbols for romance, the association mattered. The image of knights betrayed by monarchs, surviving in secrecy, resonated with men who saw themselves as rebels against kings and seekers of liberty. The Templar cross, once branded as heretical, was reborn as a quiet badge of resistance. Stories soon followed that Templar treasure had not only escaped Philip IV's grasp, but had been carried west, hidden in the vast unknown of the Americas. Tales told of ships sailing from La Rochelle in 1307, vanishing into the Atlantic, only to deposit their cargo of relics and gold on the shores of Nova Scotia or into the caves of Oak Island. The island's enigmatic money pit, with its layers of timber and flood tunnels, became one of the most enduring legends of hidden Templar wealth. In New England, whispers grew of sacred maps etched into Masonic texts, pointing to places where Templar relics had been buried. In Virginia and the Carolinas, rumors of strange stone carvings, faint crosses, and knightly sigils found among native pathways only fueled the speculation. Was the New World not just a land of opportunity, but a sanctuary chosen centuries earlier by fleeing knights? The Vatican's reach across the Atlantic was thin, but the shadows of its suspicion stretched far. If Freemasonry truly inherited the Templar mantle, then America itself might be seen as a stage for the rebirth of a brotherhood the papacy had once burned to ash. For many colonists, this was not a fear but a comfort. The idea of standing in a tradition that had resisted kings and endured the wrath of Rome gave their rebellion against the crown a mythic depth. They were not merely forging a new nation, they were completing an unfinished story, carrying the Templar banner into a promised future. Fact or fiction, it hardly mattered. The absence of certainty gave birth to legend, and legend shaped identity. Across the Atlantic, the Templars had become not just history, but destiny. By the 18th century, Europe was caught between two worlds. On one hand, the Enlightenment was tearing down superstition, insisting that truth could only be found through reason, science, and logic. On the other, the human heart still longed for mystery, for stories that reached beyond the limits of what could be measured. And in this tension, the Knights Templar found new life. Philosophers scoffed at tales of buried treasure or secret pacts with the devil. They wrote as though history was a ledger to be balanced, with no room for ghosts. Yet, even as libraries filled with rational critique, salons and lodges buzzed with whispers that the Templars had hidden knowledge forbidden by the Church, astronomical charts, alchemical formulas, even fragments of a gospel too dangerous for Rome to preserve. The Freemasons, thriving in this new intellectual climate, embraced the imagery of the temple with fervor. Their ceremonies borrowed symbols of Jerusalem and the cross, claiming a spiritual kinship with the knights who had once protected pilgrims. For many, this was less about literal lineage than about identity. To be a Mason was to be part of a brotherhood that stood against tyranny and ignorance, much as the Templars had stood against both king and pope. Writers of the Enlightenment began to use the Templars as allegory. Voltaire hinted at them as victims of religious fanaticism. Others framed their downfall as proof that the Church feared truth more than heresy. To skeptics of papal authority, the story of Jacques de Molay's burning was no longer a cautionary tale but a rallying cry, a symbol of what happens when power fears knowledge. But it was in the Romantic Age that followed, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, that the Templars shifted once again. As artists and poets turned back to medieval ruins and moonlit landscapes for inspiration, the Templars became figures of tragic nobility. Painters depicted them as fallen heroes, knights betrayed by a corrupt world, their secrets buried under ivy and stone. Writers embellished their story with dark enchantments and hidden relics, weaving them into the growing fascination with the Gothic. The Vatican, for its part, could not stop these new retellings. The same church that had once feared the order's wealth and independence now found itself unable to erase their legend. In fact, the very act of suppression centuries earlier had given the Templars a mystique no institution could control. Every gap in the record became a doorway for imagination, every missing relic an invitation to invent. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Templars were no longer just history. They had become an archetype, half martyr, half magician, summoned whenever the age needed a symbol of forbidden truth, secret wisdom, or noble defiance. As the Romantic Age deepened, the Templars' story began to slip further from the realm of history and into the half-light of myth. Europe was filled with societies, half political, half mystical, that looked backward to the Middle Ages, hungry for symbols to anchor their movements. And time and again, they turned to the image of the knight in the white mantle marked with a red cross. In dimly lit lodges, candles flickering against painted banners, initiates were told that they were inheritors of a great secret carried across the centuries. The rituals of Freemasonry became increasingly elaborate, weaving Templar imagery into their rites. The Knights Templar degree spread through Masonic orders, teaching that the brotherhood was bound not only by loyalty to one another, but by a spiritual lineage reaching back to Jerusalem itself. Whether it was true or not mattered less than the power of the idea. Poets, too, began to shape the legend. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe turned the Templar knight Brian de Bois Guilbert into a dark, tortured figure, both villain and tragic hero. In his pages, the Templars were no longer faceless soldiers of the cross, but characters filled with passion, contradiction, and desire. Romantic imagination transformed them into avatars of mystery and moral struggle, symbols of an age gone wrong. Meanwhile, occultists began to whisper that the Templars had preserved not just wealth, but knowledge, Gnostic texts, astrological charts, alchemical recipes, and fragments of a cosmic truth that the Vatican had long suppressed. The ruins of old commanderies were said to contain tunnels leading to vaults where sacred objects were hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. In Paris, secret manuscripts circulated claiming that the Templars had not died at the stake, but lived on in secret chapters, guiding history from the shadows. And then came Napoleon. As he carved his empire across Europe, Napoleon's fascination with antiquity led him into Egypt, where the discovery of strange ruins and hieroglyphs rekindled speculation about ancient connections between East and West. In this climate, it was easy for writers to draw lines between the wisdom of the pharaohs and the supposed secrets of the Templars. The Red Cross of the Order became a bridge between civilizations, a symbol said to unite the mysteries of Jerusalem, the temples of Egypt, and the cathedrals of France. By the mid-19th century, the Templars were everywhere, appearing in operas, novels, paintings, and the secret charters of societies both serious and eccentric. Their image had become fluid. They could be depicted as martyrs of faith, keepers of forbidden science, or shadowy conspirators. And in every case, the Vatican's old condemnation only added fuel to the fascination. For what institution would burn so violently to ashes unless there was truly something to fear? The stage was set. The Templars were no longer bound by their own history. They had become a canvas, a mirror for every generation's hopes and terrors. And in the centuries that followed, this mirror would only grow darker, reflecting obsessions with conspiracy, hidden bloodlines, and truths too dangerous to say aloud. By the 19th century, the Templar legend had swollen into something far larger than the history itself. The Enlightenment had tried to strip their story bare. The Romantics had clothed it in moonlight and myth. But now came a new age, an age obsessed with power behind the curtain, with secret hands shaping the world. In this age, the Knights Templar became the perfect vessel for conspiracy. Pamphlets circulated through the streets of Paris and London, claiming that the order had never been destroyed. They whispered of a hidden chapter, a clandestine brotherhood that slipped underground after 1312 and guided history from the shadows. Every revolution, every collapse, every sudden rise of a dynasty was attributed not to chance, but to the Red Cross that had once flown over Jerusalem. Banking dynasties were the first to be linked. The Templars, after all, had been Europe's original bankers, creating letters of credit that allowed pilgrims to travel safely. By the 19th century, this fact became the seed of suspicion. Were the great fortunes of Europe, the Rothschilds, the Habsburgs, descendants of Templar treasure? Writers spun tales of underground vaults beneath Paris, Florence, and London, where the order's gold lay untouched, funding causes that only a chosen few could understand. The French Revolution became another thread. Radical writers claimed that the overthrow of the monarchy was, in truth, a Templar revenge. A settling of scores centuries after Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in Paris. The guillotine, they said, was not just a symbol of liberty, but of justice long delayed, a blade raised in the name of the knights betrayed by king and pope alike. In Germany, secret societies fueled the fire. The Illuminati, already notorious in the public imagination, were rumored to have drawn from Templar rituals. In Masonic lodges across Europe, new Templar degrees appeared, claiming lineage to the lost order. For many, it was not enough to be a Mason. One had to trace back to the Knights, to cloak oneself in the aura of betrayal, vengeance, and hidden wisdom. And so, the line between history and fantasy blurred. The Vatican's silence became a stage on which others performed their fears and desires. Each missing record, each lost charter, was filled with speculation. Were the Templars keepers of a bloodline, guardians of a heretical gospel, or simply ghosts, haunting Europe with the memory of what happens when power is feared more than understood? By the dawn of the 20th century, the Templars were no longer a medieval order. They had become the skeleton key of conspiracy. Fit them into any lock, finance, politics, religion, and the story would turn. The 19th century fascination with the Templars bled naturally into the 20th, when Europe's imagination became darker, stranger, and more dangerous. Secret societies no longer belonged just to pamphlets and whispers. They began to claim real power, shaping movements and ideologies that would scar the century. The occult revival of the late 1800s was the first stage. Writers such as Eliphas Lévy and later occultists cast the Templars not as bankers or warriors, but as magicians. They spoke of hidden rites performed in candlelit chambers, of a secret knowledge that survived the pyres of 1314. The Baphomet, once a grotesque accusation hurled at the knights by their inquisitors, was reborn as a symbol in esoteric texts, its goat-headed figure no longer a mark of shame, but a cipher of ancient wisdom. Templar trials, twisted and misunderstood, were now cited as proof that the knights had guarded arcane truths the Church could not allow to survive. From there, the fascination slid into darker currents. In Germany, a nation reeling from defeat in World War I, secret groups like the Thule Society reached for myths to explain their humiliation and to build a vision of rebirth. The Templars, with their blend of martial power, martyrdom, and secrecy, became a model. Some occult nationalist groups claimed to inherit their mantle, linking the Red Cross to blood purity, sacrifice, and a hidden destiny for the German people. When the Nazi Party rose to power, these fantasies did not disappear. Though Hitler himself mocked occultists in private, men around him, Himmler above all, were drawn to them. At Wewelsburg Castle, Himmler dreamed of creating a new knightly order, a black-cloaked brotherhood modeled not on the Templars' downfall, but on their imagined eternity. Ceremonies, relic hunts, and whispers of the Grail all folded into this grotesque reinvention of medieval legend as a tool of modern totalitarianism. The irony was thick. The very charges once used to destroy the Templars, heresy, secret rituals, hidden power, were now embraced and reimagined as virtues by those who sought to control the 20th century. The Templars became both a warning and a blueprint, a reminder of what happens when myth outpaces history and when obsession with the past becomes a weapon in the present. As the war ended and Europe sifted through its ruins, these stories did not die. If anything, they grew louder. In the ashes of totalitarianism, people sought explanations, and many found them in tales of secret orders pulling strings behind the scenes. The Templars were once again at the center of it, this time not as Knights of Jerusalem, but as shadows cast across the world's stage. When the smoke of World War II cleared, Europe was exhausted, but the hunger for hidden explanations only deepened. How could so much destruction have been unleashed? How could entire nations fall under the spell of madness? For many, the answer could not lie in ordinary politics. It had to be something older, something deeper, an invisible hand guiding history. And once again, the Knights Templar were summoned into the story. In the late 1940s and 1950s, fringe writers began to weave together the Templars, the Freemasons, and modern governments into a single narrative. They claimed that the Red Cross of the Order had never truly burned out on the pyres of Paris, that it had been carried underground, embedded within lodges, societies, and eventually woven into the fabric of new political powers. Some pamphlets in Britain even suggested that the American Revolution itself had been influenced by Masonic offshoots, claiming descent from the Templars. The Red Cross, they argued, now flew invisibly over parliaments and congresses, disguised in symbols that most people overlooked. In France, the 1950s also brought a strange fusion of Catholic anxiety and esoteric speculation. Writers hinted that the Vatican's silence about certain archives was proof of complicity, that Clement V's pact had never truly ended, and that the papacy had been engaged in a centuries-long negotiation with hidden powers descended from the Templars. To these writers, every papal concordat, every quiet deal between Rome and states, was part of an ancient script written in 1307 and still unfolding. But it was in the United States that the story took on its most potent new form. In the climate of Cold War suspicion, where citizens worried about communists hiding in plain sight, conspiracy theorists found fertile ground. They spoke of a new world order, a phrase that would echo for decades, and in this imagined order, the Templars were often cast as the first architects. Their banking networks, their secret rituals, their sudden destruction, all were repurposed as evidence that they had gone underground, merely waiting for the right time to rise again and claim control on a global scale. For many listeners, these tales felt logical, even if they were fantastical. After all, the Templars had truly been rich. They had truly been powerful. They had truly been betrayed by both king and pope. If such a force could vanish once, why not twice or 3 times, reappearing under new names? By the 1960s, the hidden Templar had become a permanent fixture in the conspiracy imagination. No longer just a medieval order, they were now timeless, eternal engineers of history, shadows behind every revolution, every war, every new power rising on the stage. By the 1970s, the Templar myth had fully broken free from the confines of history. No longer just medieval knights in white cloaks, they had become a kind of blank canvas onto which people projected their deepest fears and wildest fantasies. One strand turned toward blood. Writers in Europe and America began to claim that the Templars had not only preserved relics, but bloodlines. They linked the order to the old Merovingian kings of France, a dynasty long shrouded in rumor, said to descend from the union of Christ and Mary Magdalene. Books whispered of marriages hidden from history, children protected by oaths, and secret dynasties stretching quietly into the present day. The Vatican, in this telling, had tried to erase these truths, but the Templars had preserved them in exile. Every noble family with a curious crest or an old rumor suddenly became a candidate for the sacred lineage. Another strand looked up, not down. In the wake of the space race and the cultural explosion of UFO lore, Some began to wonder whether the Templars' mysterious knowledge was not earthly at all. They pointed to carvings on old chapels, symbols of stars and wheels, suggesting the knights had been custodians of ancient contact stories. A few fringe books in the 1970s even claimed the Grail itself was not a chalice, but a craft, a vessel from beyond the skies, hidden by those who had sworn eternal secrecy. To these writers, the Templars were no longer just guardians of relics, but keepers of humanity's oldest and strangest encounter. Both bloodline and UFO theories shared a common thread. They offered mystery where history had gaps. Why were the Templars so suddenly destroyed? Why did their myths survive when other orders faded? Why did kings and popes fear them? For those suspicious of official answers, the silence became evidence. The lack of proof was itself the proof. By the 1980s, these ideas had begun to merge. Popular books mixed the Grail, the Magdalene, the Templars, the Vatican, and even extraterrestrial watchers into a single sweeping tapestry. It was a story that explained everything and nothing all at once. To some, it was thrilling. To others, it was dangerous. A way of turning faith, politics, and science into one great conspiracy. And yet, people kept listening. Because beneath all the wild claims was one enduring truth. The Knights Templar really had existed, really had risen to power, and really had been struck down by fire and decree. That kernel of history gave the wildest myths just enough gravity to pull listeners in, generation after generation. By the late 20th century, the Templars were no longer confined to dusty archives, academic circles, or whispered conspiracy theories. They had stepped fully into the realm of mass culture. What had once been the subject of scholarly footnotes and half-forgotten chronicles was now printed on airport bestsellers, splashed across movie screens, and woven into video games. It began with books. In 1982, Holy Blood, Holy Grail exploded onto the publishing world. Its authors took decades of speculation, the Templars' supposed ties to hidden bloodlines, the survival of Christ's descendants, and the Vatican's cover-ups, and packaged them into a single sweeping narrative. For many readers, this was their first encounter with the idea that the medieval knights might have carried secrets far beyond Jerusalem's walls. Though historians criticized the book as speculative and ungrounded, it sold in staggering numbers, setting the stage for a cultural wave. That wave reached new heights with Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code in 2003. Suddenly, millions were chasing Templar secrets through the Louvre, the Vatican, and cryptic Renaissance paintings. The story of Mary Magdalene's hidden role, of a sacred bloodline guarded by a secret brotherhood, became a global phenomenon. Tourists flocked to Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, convinced that under its ornate carvings lay evidence of Templar treasure. Overnight, the order had become less a historical subject and more a brand, a shorthand for hidden knowledge, sacred rebellion, and conspiracies older than kings. Cinema had already primed audiences for this. From the mysterious Grail Knights in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, to countless TV documentaries promising to uncover the truth, the Templars had been reimagined as timeless guardians and villains alike. In comic books, they fought alongside superheroes. In fantasy novels, they re-emerged as immortal warrior monks. In role-playing games, they became symbols of both holy zeal and secret corruption. Even video games joined the chorus. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed series turned the Templars into global antagonists, a shadowy force manipulating history from the Crusades to the modern day. For an entire generation, the name Templar no longer evoked dusty manuscripts, but rooftop chases, hidden blades, and conspiracies stretching through centuries. And yet, underneath the fiction, something real persisted. The fascination came not only from the stories themselves, but from the way they blurred lines between fact and imagination. Audiences knew the Templars had been real, that they had been destroyed in a sudden purge, that their wealth and records vanished. That reality provided the anchor that made every wild tale, whether about bloodlines, UFOs, or global conspiracies, feel just a little bit possible. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Knights Templar were everywhere. They were no longer just a historical order of warrior monks. They were an archetype, a cultural symbol, and in becoming that symbol, they escaped history's chains, ensuring their survival in a way their founders could never have imagined. As the myths about the Templars spread across bookshelves, cinema screens, and gaming consoles, the Vatican found itself in an odd position. On one hand, these stories were wildly fictional, full of conspiracies that no serious historian could endorse. On the other, they placed the Catholic Church directly in the role of antagonist, the institution that had silenced, betrayed, and destroyed a holy brotherhood to protect its own power. The Church had been here before. For centuries, whispers had linked Rome to hidden archives, locked vaults beneath the apostolic palace, and manuscripts deliberately kept from public eyes. Now, in the age of mass media, those whispers became mainstream. Each time a novel or documentary mentioned secret Vatican files or forbidden gospels, audiences leaned in. The myth didn't weaken the Church's aura of power, it magnified it. For the Vatican, this was both a gift and a curse. In the 2000s, as the Da Vinci Code drew international attention, officials at the Vatican denounced the story as a work of fantasy and urged Catholics to resist its seductive narrative. But such denials often had the opposite effect. The more strongly the Vatican objected, the more audiences believed there must be something to hide. After all, if the story were mere fiction, why react so fiercely? Meanwhile, scholars inside the Church tried to reframe the conversation. Jesuit historians published careful studies on the Templars, reminding the world that they had been men of their time, warriors, bankers, and pilgrims, subject to the same political storms as any medieval order. Some archivists even opened up limited collections of medieval papal documents, hoping that transparency would cool speculation. Yet the release of documents showing that Pope Clement V may have absolved the Templars of heresy only fueled curiosity. If the Pope himself had once doubted the charges, then why had the Knights burned? For conspiracy theorists, this was perfect material. To them, it proved the Church had always known the Templars were innocent and had destroyed them anyway. For the Vatican, it was proof of the enduring difficulty. History was not enough. Once myth had taken root, no amount of documents could stop it from growing. By the early 21st century, the Vatican learned to live with the Templar obsession. Its officials rarely engaged directly with the wilder claims. Instead, the strategy shifted. Emphasize faith, ritual, and present-day relevance, and let the myths swirl on the outside. Yet in the quiet halls of the Vatican archives, curators knew one thing for certain. So long as there were locked doors and unopened boxes, the Templars would remain alive in the public imagination, not as history, but as legend. When the Templar order was dissolved in 1312, their banners lowered and their leaders burned, one might think their story ended in smoke. Yet paradoxically, that violent destruction only gave the order a second life. The Templars' very absence created a vacuum that countless groups, centuries later, rushed to fill. By the Enlightenment era, whispers of their survival resurfaced in salons and taverns across Europe. The most famous inheritors were the Freemasons. In the 18th century, Masonic lodges began to claim that they preserved the secret rites of the Knights Templar. Scottish rite rituals, for example, invoked the Templars as martyrs of truth, destroyed by papal tyranny. Whether these connections were historically accurate mattered less than the symbolism. The Templar myth gave the Freemasons an aura of ancient legitimacy, a bridge between medieval mystery and modern brotherhood. But Freemasons were not alone. Smaller, stranger groups arose. Rosicrucians claimed hidden Templar wisdom about alchemy and the transformation of the soul. Mystical orders across Germany and France wrote manifestos that traced their lineage back to the Crusader Knights. In each case, the Templars functioned like a mirror. Groups projected their own ideals: freedom, secret wisdom, rebellion against authority, onto the image of warrior monks betrayed by church and crown. The irony is that the historical Templars left behind no such doctrine. Their surviving rulebooks and financial ledgers speak of discipline, tithes, and logistics, not mystical formulas or bloodline secrets. Yet that very silence invited imagination. A burned library leaves gaps, and those gaps are fertile ground for legend. By the 19th century, secret societies across Europe competed to style themselves as neo-Templar orders. Some were serious fraternal groups, performing elaborate ceremonies in imitation of medieval initiation rites. Others were little more than clubs for the wealthy and curious, donning white mantles and red crosses for dramatic effect. In the popular press, they became the stuff of rumor. Men meeting in candlelit chambers, whispering of ancient vows and lost treasures. The power of the Templar name was undeniable. It offered both tragedy and triumph. Martyrs who had been betrayed, yet whose spirit lived on. And for groups seeking to cloak themselves in mystery, there could be no better ancestors. Whether or not the lineage was real, the belief in that lineage gave them purpose. Thus, the order lived on in a new form, less as knights with swords, and more as symbols stitched into secret ceremonies. Where steel had failed, myth endured. And that endurance would shape both conspiracies and cultural memory well into the modern age. By the 19th century, the Templar myth was no longer confined to dusty lodges or whispered rituals. It began to seep into politics, a convenient banner for movements that wanted to borrow the authority of the past while pushing new agendas. In France, during the waves of revolution and restoration, the name Templar became a rallying cry for those who saw themselves as heirs to a legacy of betrayal and injustice. Radical pamphleteers invoked the fate of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, as proof that corrupt kings and priests could not be trusted. In their telling, de Molay was not merely a medieval victim, but a symbol of all who defied tyranny and paid the price. His ashes, they said, still blew across Paris as a warning to oppressors. Elsewhere, the allure of the Templars took stranger forms. Fringe monarchist groups in Italy claimed that hidden Templar treasures would one day restore their royal houses to power. In Germany, Romantic nationalists wrote poems linking the Templars to a pure, chivalric spirit they believed had been lost in the march of modernity. And in Britain, amateur historians speculated that Templar refugees had carried their secrets overseas, planting the seeds of hidden colonies in Scotland or even across the Atlantic. By the 20th century, these political appropriations grew darker. Authoritarian regimes, eager to wrap themselves in the trappings of myth, found in the Templars a story they could twist. Propaganda recast the knights as either noble martyrs or sinister conspirators, depending on the message needed. For some, they were a warning of what happens when religious and financial power collides unchecked. For others, they were painted as a heroic elite, unjustly crushed by corrupt institutions. The strange flexibility of the Templar story, its ability to mean rebellion for one side and loyalty for another, gave it immense staying power. To revolutionaries, it was a tale of betrayal by authority. To nationalists, it was proof of ancient identity. To secret orders, it was validation of mystical heritage. And to conspiracy theorists, it was evidence that nothing in history is ever what it seems. The real Templars, of course, had been soldiers and administrators, bound by vows of poverty and service. But by the time their name was wielded in parliaments, pamphlets, and propaganda posters, that reality no longer mattered. The Templars had escaped the prison of history and become something more dangerous, a floating symbol, ready to be used by anyone who needed its power. And in that transformation, the Vatican once again found itself uncomfortably in the background. The same church that had condemned the order centuries earlier was now accused, by radicals and traditionalists alike, of having covered up truths too dangerous to release. The myth had outrun the facts, and there was no pulling it back. By the time the 20th century was in full swing, the Knights Templar had already left the realm of dusty chronicles and entered something far more enduring, the collective imagination. What began as papal bulls and crusader records now lived in novels, comic books, films, and eventually video games. And with each retelling, their story grew less historical and more mythical. The first major wave came with the Romantic movement of the 19th century. Poets and painters, hungry for tragic heroes and ruined castles, rediscovered the Templars as doomed martyrs. Jacques de Molay became the Byronic figure par excellence, betrayed, burned alive, yet defiant in death. Plays and operas staged his last words as thunderous curses, sometimes shaking the heavens themselves. By the time these tales spread, the order was no longer just an institution of soldier monks. They were larger than life. Then came the age of pulp and adventure. Early 20th century writers like Sir Walter Scott had already sown the seeds with Ivanhoe, where the Templar Brian de Bois Guilbert embodied both nobility and corruption. Later novelists took it further, weaving the Templars into stories of hidden treasure, forbidden love, and ancient conspiracies. The image of secret Templar vaults, filled with relics, gold, and even the Holy Grail, began to take firm root in the popular mind. The cinema only magnified the myth. Silent films first dabbled with crusader imagery, but by mid-century, Templar knights were everywhere, standing tall in shining white cloaks or lurking as villains with secret designs. By the time the Indiana Jones franchise and later the Assassin's Creed games arrived, the Templars had become a shorthand symbol. Guardians of mystery, keepers of forbidden power, enemies who sought to control the world from behind the scenes. It is worth noting that almost none of this resembled the historical order. The real Templars kept ledgers, paid taxes, and argued with kings over property boundaries. Yet who wanted to remember accountants when you could imagine treasure hunters and secret kings? Myths, once freed from their historical cages, tend to evolve toward what audiences crave: mystery, danger, romance. And so the Templars became eternal, no longer confined to dusty manuscripts, but alive in the glowing images on cinema screens and the pixelated landscapes of video games. If a child today hears the word Templar, they are more likely to think of glowing crosses, buried relics, and whispered conspiracies than of banking records or papal politics. That transformation, from history to legend to global pop culture archetype, ensured that the Templars would never truly die. Their story had passed from parchment to imagination, from memory to myth. And perhaps that, more than their crusades or their trials, is their most lasting conquest. If novels and films turned the Templars into romantic heroes, conspiracy theorists gave them a far stranger afterlife. For some, the Templars were not martyrs of faith, but architects of a shadow empire, puppet masters whose influence stretched invisibly across centuries. The seed was planted in the 18th and 19th centuries, when anti-Masonic pamphlets accused Freemasons of being the direct descendants of the Knights Templar. This claim, meant to discredit the Masons as heretical, ironically made them sound far more powerful. If the Templars had survived their official suppression, then they must have carried with them something so dangerous that both king and pope conspired to silence it. By the 20th century, this idea metastasized into dozens of theories. Some insisted the Templars guarded the Holy Grail, keeping it hidden in Scotland or buried under Rosslyn Chapel. Others believed they spirited away ancient scrolls from beneath the Temple Mount, documents that could upend Christianity itself. A few even suggested that the order discovered knowledge of extraterrestrial visitors, dressing it in biblical language until the world was ready to understand. In fringe literature, the Templars became a cipher that could mean anything. To those suspicious of banks and global finance, they were the first international bankers, proof that secret wealth had always ruled the world. To occult writers, they were the keepers of lost Gnostic or Hermetic wisdom. To political radicals, they symbolized either noble resistance to tyranny or the first cabal of authoritarian manipulators. What all these theories shared was the magnetic power of a gap in history. The sudden destruction of the order, the missing records of their wealth, the unsolved question of what happened to their treasure. These silences invited speculation. Into that void, each generation projected its own fears and fascinations. Of course, historians can debunk most of these claims. There is no reliable evidence of hidden grails, UFO scrolls, or shadow governments stretching unbroken from 1312 to the present. Yet the appeal of the Templar conspiracy lies less in evidence and more in the thrill of possibility. What if the Vatican truly hid a gospel that contradicted its authority? What if a lost vault beneath Paris held proof of secret bloodlines? The absence of proof became proof enough. In a way, this was the Templars' second death. The first came when the flames consumed Jacques de Molay in Paris. The second came when the order was absorbed into the machinery of modern mythmaking, stripped of their real humanity and turned into symbols for every secret fear. But symbols endure longer than men, and the Templars, whatever the truth, had become the most durable of all. Ghosts summoned not by candles and prayers, but by paperback novels, online forums, and whispered theories shared in the dark corners of the internet. For centuries after the execution of Jacques de Molay, the Vatican maintained an almost studied silence about the Knights Templar. The papal bulls of suppression remained on the books. No formal rehabilitation was offered, no recognition of injustice granted. It was as though the Church had quietly locked the Templars in a vault of history and thrown away the key. And yet, the silence itself spoke. Every unanswered question about the Templars' trial, every uncorrected charge of heresy, fed the idea that the Church was hiding something. Historians petitioned for access to Vatican archives, where tens of thousands of parchment pages remain stacked in sealed bundles. The Vatican rarely said no outright, but doors closed slowly, permissions expired quickly, and certain files were deemed too fragile to handle. To many, that hesitation felt like proof of secrets worth protecting. That began to change in 2001, when Barbara Frail, a Vatican archivist, stumbled across a misplaced volume. the Chinon parchment. Inside was a record of Clement V's private absolution of the Templar leaders in 1308. Contrary to centuries of accusation, the Pope had not judged the order heretical. He had absolved them of sin, acknowledging their confessions as products of torture. The parchment had sat unnoticed for nearly 700 years. When the Vatican published the document in 2007, it stunned the world. For some, it was vindication. The Templars had been scapegoated by Philip IV of France, and the Church had quietly known it all along. For others, it was too little, too late, a symbolic gesture that could not undo centuries of rumor. Why, critics asked, had the parchment remained hidden? Was it truly misfiled or intentionally buried? The Church's reticence only added to the mystique. The Vatican has never issued a sweeping statement exonerating the Templars. It has not canonized their leaders, nor reconstituted the order. Instead, it lets the parchment speak in silence, a fragment of truth released into the world, surrounded by 1,000 unanswered questions. And so, the Templars remain in limbo, neither heretics nor saints, neither condemned nor restored. That ambiguity has proved more powerful than any verdict. For believers in hidden gospels, in buried treasures, in bloodlines suppressed by papal decree, the silence of Rome is fertile ground. Where the Church hesitates, imagination rushes in. The Vatican's long silence, then, may not be accidental. It may be a strategy, a way of letting the Templars' shadow absorb attention, while the Church itself avoids both blame and commitment. After all, what institution benefits more from mystery than one built on faith? When the Chinon parchment was revealed, journalists pressed Vatican officials for a response. Would the Church apologize? Would it honor the Templars as martyrs of faith? The answers were careful, measured, and ultimately evasive. History must be understood in its context, one spokesperson said. Another remarked that the Vatican does not issue verdicts on events centuries past. That restraint was deliberate. For the Church, revisiting the Templar trial is not simply about correcting history. It is about reopening a wound in its own authority. To admit openly that Clement V bowed to Philip IV's pressure would be to acknowledge that the papacy, supposedly the rock of Christendom, once bent under the will of a temporal king. And that is not a story the Vatican is eager to emphasize. Still, within Catholic circles, the Templars are not forgotten. Scholars like Barbara Fraile have argued that the order's trial was a miscarriage of justice, a failure of leadership at the highest level. Others see the Templars as a mirror of the Church's ongoing struggle with power and corruption. When the Church wields the sword of the state, one Jesuit historian wrote, it forgets the humility of the gospel. In this view, the Templars' destruction is not just medieval history, but a parable of what happens when faith and politics become inseparable. There are also voices within modern Catholicism that treat the Templars with quiet reverence. Pilgrims visit Templar chapels in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, kneeling before altars built by men once branded as heretics. Catholic lay fraternities sometimes invoke the Templar name in their rituals, blending knightly imagery with devotional practice. Though unofficial, these gestures reveal how enduring the order's aura remains inside the fold of Rome. Yet the Vatican itself stays cautious. When asked about modern groups calling themselves Neo-Templars, officials distance the Church, stressing that no continuity exists between the medieval order and any contemporary organization. The danger, from their perspective, is that the Templars might be claimed by factions, conspiracy theorists, occultists, or even political extremists, who see in the order a banner for their own agendas. And so, Rome walks a narrow path. It neither condemns nor celebrates, neither buries nor resurrects. The Templars hover in the Church's narrative like ghosts, reminders of both its grandeur and its failures, too useful to forget, too dangerous to embrace. Perhaps that is the most fitting outcome of all, an order born in obedience to the papacy, undone by papal decree, and remembered only through the Vatican's silences. In those silences, myths multiply, and in those myths, the Templars live on. Outside the walls of the Vatican, historians have approached the Knights Templar with less caution and more curiosity. To them, the Templars are not saints or demons, but an extraordinary window into the Middle Ages, a fraternity of warriors and monks who became a financial empire, a military backbone, and a cultural symbol all at once. In university lecture halls and archival reading rooms, the story begins not with their trial, but with their rise. Scholars stress how unusual the Templars really were. Monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet wielded swords, managed estates, and brokered loans between kings. They were a paradox, and it is in that paradox that historians find their fascination. Some have gone further, arguing that the Templars laid the groundwork for modern institutions. Their banking practices, letters of credit, safe transfers of money across borders, foreshadowed international finance. Their castles, designed with concentric fortifications, influenced European military architecture for centuries. Their rule, a hybrid of monastic discipline and martial pragmatism, reads almost like a corporate charter, centuries before corporations existed. But historians also wrestle with the darker side of the order. The Templars were not only guardians of pilgrims, but also enforcers of papal ambition. In the Holy Land, their campaigns sometimes blurred into massacres. Their wealth, though earned through service, made them arrogant in the eyes of rivals. And their secrecy, the rituals behind closed doors, the refusal to bow to local bishops, fueled suspicion long before Philip IV exploited it. What makes the Templar story so captivating for historians is how incomplete it remains. Even with archives, charters, and chronicles, there are gaps. Wide enough for questions, but not wide enough for certainty. Did they truly dig beneath the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem? Were their initiation rites misinterpreted or deliberately strange? Did they carry relics westward after Acre's fall? Or did they simply vanish into the records of royal treasuries? Each of these questions sparks debate. Some scholars, cautious and conservative, dismiss the legends as later inventions. Others, more daring, allow that myths often preserve fragments of truth. What cannot be denied is that the order's sudden and brutal suppression created a vacuum, and vacuums attract stories. From the academic perspective, the Templars endure not because of their destruction, but because of what they represented. The tension between faith and power, idealism and corruption, secrecy and transparency. They are a prism through which we glimpse both the brilliance and the brutality of medieval Europe. For the modern historian, then, the Templars are not a conspiracy. They are something more human, and perhaps more haunting. An experiment in mixing heaven and earth, undone by the very forces they served. As careful as professional historians are, their work often collides with something much harder to contain: the popular imagination. In archives, the Templars are parchment and seals, inventories of horses and lists of rents. But outside those quiet rooms, they are ghosts, guardians, and keepers of forbidden truths. The difference between history and legend is like the difference between ink and flame. One records, the other ignites. This divide is part of why the Templars remain so compelling. Academic historians publish cautious monographs reminding us that no evidence exists for secret gospels or hidden treasure. Yet novels and films thrive precisely because of those gaps. Where the historian stops, the storyteller begins, and people, often without realizing it, prefer the story. Take the popular idea that the Templars unearthed something beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Scholars point out there is no direct record of such a discovery, but the silence itself becomes tantalizing. If the order left no clear trace, why not imagine what they might have hidden? A relic of Christ, a scroll suppressed by Rome, a knowledge too dangerous to share? Each theory fuels bookshelves, documentaries, and late-night conversations. The same happens with their supposed survival. Historians explain that after 1312 many Templars joined other orders, like the Hospitallers, or simply returned to secular life. But in legend, the order endures as a secret brotherhood, infiltrating Freemasonry, sailing west to America, or guarding relics in forgotten chapels. The reality may be less glamorous, but the legend is infinitely more magnetic. This tension frustrates some scholars, who feel their meticulous work is overshadowed by fantasy. But others acknowledge that the myth-making is part of the Templar legacy itself. From their very beginning, the order cultivated mystery. Their vows were taken in private. Their ceremonies were closed. Their seal, 2 knights riding 1 horse, seemed designed to invite speculation. They lived in secrecy, and secrecy breeds stories. For the general public, then, the Templars are not just monks with swords. They are symbols of something missing in modern life. A sense of hidden order, a key to mysteries, a link to a world larger than the one we see. Whether that world ever existed is almost beside the point. What matters is that the idea of it survives. And so, history and legend continue to walk side by side. The historian offers careful context. The storyteller offers wonder, and the Templars, whether they would have wanted it or not, live somewhere between the two. By the time the dust of the Middle Ages had settled, the Templars no longer existed as a functioning order. But centuries later, their ghost reappeared, not in monasteries or castles, but in lodge rooms filled with candles, symbols, and whispered oaths. The Freemasons, emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries, claimed a lineage that stretched back through medieval stonemasons, cathedral builders, and, most provocatively, the Knights Templar. In their rituals, the Templars were reimagined as keepers of hidden wisdom, guardians of truths too sacred for the Church to preserve. It was less about historical continuity and more about symbolic inheritance. The attraction was obvious. To men of the Enlightenment, who sought a brotherhood beyond church dogma and royal decree, the Templar story offered legitimacy. Here was a group that had defied kings and popes, suffered martyrdom, and carried with them the aura of secrecy. By weaving the Templars into their own mythology, the Masons gave themselves a pedigree of courage and mystery. Some lodges even introduced Templar degrees, ceremonies that dramatized the trial of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master. Candidates were asked to take vows of loyalty in memory of betrayed knights, to swear upon symbols of sword and cross. Though the history behind these rituals was invented, the power of the narrative was undeniable. It gave members the sense that they were part of a chain stretching back to crusader castles and papal dungeons. Outside the lodges, the connection spread quickly. Pamphlets and books began to circulate claiming that the Templars had never been destroyed at all. Instead, they had gone underground, preserving their treasures and teachings until the time was right to reemerge. In an age already alive with secret clubs, coffeehouse conspiracies, and whispered revolutions, such claims fell on fertile ground. This was the birth of a new kind of Templar, not the historical soldier monks, but the mythic architects of hidden history. In some versions, they were rebels against church corruption. In others, they were stewards of forbidden knowledge passed down from ancient Israel or Egypt. Each retelling said more about the hopes and fears of the storyteller than about the knights themselves. By the 18th century, this Templar Masonic fusion had become so widespread that even critics of Freemasonry treated it as fact. Anti-Masonic writers accused the lodges of harboring a Templar revenge plot against church and state. Revolutionaries, particularly in France, leaned on the imagery of avenging Molay as they attacked monarchy and altar alike. The irony is striking. A medieval order destroyed for its supposed secrets became the centerpiece of a modern movement, fueled by secrecy. What was once an accusation of heresy became a badge of honor, proudly displayed on banners and in rituals. And so, in the flicker of lodge candles, the Templars lived again, not as warriors in chainmail, but as shadows in the imagination, claimed by men who needed them to legitimize their own quests for freedom, fraternity, and mystery. Once the Templar myth had been absorbed into the fabric of Freemasonry, it didn't stay confined to candlelit lodge rooms. It spilled outward into the roaring tides of revolution that were reshaping Europe and the Americas. In France, whispers of Jacques de Molay's betrayal became a rallying cry. Radical pamphleteers drew parallels between a king who had burned knights at the stake and the monarchy that now squeezed the people of France with taxes and privilege. Some claimed that Louis XIV's execution in 1793 was not merely political justice but cosmic vengeance, the spirit of the last Grand Master finally striking back at the Capuchin line. Whether anyone truly believed this or simply used it for rhetoric, the idea took hold. The Templar flame had become a revolutionary torch. In the Americas, too, Masonic lodges thrived. Founding figures like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin carried within their circles the same Templar-influenced rites that dramatized betrayal and martyrdom. They didn't call themselves Templars, but the symbolism was present. Oaths of secrecy, brotherhood beyond creed or crown, ideals of liberty that echoed the myth of knights who had stood against the powers of their age. The Templar story became a skeleton key, unlocking different meanings depending on who held it. To some, it represented rebellion against church corruption. To others, it was a symbol of enlightened resistance against tyrants. And to conspiracy theorists, even in those days, it suggested that a secret cabal had been steering history for centuries, moving kings like chess pieces, hiding ancient treasures, keeping the real truth from the world. This fusion of Masonic ritual and Templar myth made its way into art and architecture. Obelisks, pentagrams, cryptic inscriptions, and references to Jerusalem began to decorate monuments from Paris to Washington, D.C. These were not historical continuities, but imaginative ones, a way of saying we are heirs to something older, something suppressed but never silenced. The Church, meanwhile, grew uneasy. By the 19th century, Catholic polemicists were accusing Freemasons of being the spiritual descendants of the Templars, not in honor, but in heresy. For them, the Templar revival was proof that the Devil's Order had survived in secret. What Philip IV and Clement V had supposedly destroyed had instead gone underground, only to rise again in the form of lodges and revolutions. The irony is almost too perfect. What began as a political smear in the 14th century had become, 4 centuries later, a badge of honor for those who sought to remake the world. The charges of heresy and secret rites, once meant to destroy the Templars, were now proudly dramatized by men who wanted to claim their legacy. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Knights Templar were no longer just medieval monks with swords. They had become something larger, symbols of betrayal and resistance, martyrs of secrecy and power, shadows whose presence was felt in every revolution, every conspiracy theory, every whispered tale of hidden masters behind the scenes of history. And this transformation, from flesh and blood warriors to archetypes of rebellion, was only the beginning of their modern afterlife. The 19th century was a crucible of fascination, where science and superstition collided. Steam engines roared, telegraphs crackled, and Darwin unsettled the foundations of creation. Yet in the same salons where men argued about evolution, others whispered about alchemy, hidden bloodlines, and the Knights Templar. Romantics and occultists seized upon the Templars as if they were a missing puzzle piece to explain history's hidden currents. The Enlightenment had stripped the world of its mystery. The Templar myth offered it back in spades. What better symbol of forbidden knowledge than a brotherhood that had supposedly unearthed secrets beneath the Temple of Solomon? Writers began spinning tales of treasures that had never been catalogued. Manuscripts salvaged from Herod's walls, fragments of Gospels that challenged the Church's authority, chalices of unearthly beauty said to heal the faithful. It was here that the Holy Grail, once a medieval romance motif, became tightly bound to the Templar legend. According to some, the Knights had not only found it, but hidden it away, passing guardianship through centuries of secret orders. At the same time, a different myth took root, the idea of a hidden bloodline. If Christ had descendants, the story went, then the Templars were their protectors. This was not history in any academic sense. It was legend, crafted from longing. But the more it was repeated, the more powerful it became. By the mid-19th century, French esoteric writers like Eliphas Lévi were tying the Templars into vast systems of hidden knowledge, where Kabbalistic symbols, alchemy, and Christianity all blended into one tapestry. The Templars were no longer just medieval warriors in chainmail. They were depicted as magi, alchemists, keepers of gnosis. Secret societies sprouted across Europe, from Parisian Rosicrucians to German occult circles, each claiming that their rituals preserved fragments of the Templar inheritance. Candles burned, swords were crossed, Latin was muttered, not as reenactments of history, but as invocations of a lineage that had never truly died. Even mainstream culture was not immune. Novels and operas began to cast the Templars as tragic, mysterious figures, doomed heroes guarding secrets too dangerous to reveal. Their destruction by Philip IV and Clement V was reimagined not as justice, but as suppression. The Church was cast as the jealous destroyer of hidden truth, and the Templars as martyrs of wisdom. This was also the age when pseudo-archaeology blossomed. Antiquarians pointed to strange symbols carved into chapels, markings on gravestones, even the alignment of cathedrals, claiming they were Templar codes hiding the path to treasure or revelation. Whether true or not, the sheer volume of speculation gave the impression that the world was covered in their fingerprints. By 1880, the Templar myth was no longer just about knights in armor. It was about what they represented: rebellion against authority, the promise of hidden wisdom, and the tantalizing idea that history still concealed secrets waiting to be uncovered. And with the dawn of the 20th century, those secrets would find a new home in the world of pseudo-history, nationalist myth-making, and eventually popular fiction. The late 19th century was fertile ground for conspiracy. Industrial cities grew restless, monarchies trembled, revolutions whispered in the streets. And amid all this chaos, the story of the Knights Templar offered something solid, secretive, and powerful. Writers and secret society leaders alike discovered how malleable the Templar legend was. It could be bent to suit almost any agenda. To nationalists, the Templars were the defenders of a true Christian Europe, betrayed by a corrupt papacy. To occultists, they were custodians of Egyptian mysteries and Kabbalistic wisdom. To political radicals, they were martyrs to tyranny, proof that powerful elites always crush those who challenge their monopoly on truth. One thread that grew stronger in this era was the black legend of the Templars. Where medieval inquisitors had accused them of worshipping idols or spitting on the cross, 19th century conspiracy theorists took those same charges and reframed them as hidden power. The Templars weren't heretics, the theory went. They were initiates. They had uncovered truths so explosive that Rome and Philip IV had to destroy them. Pamphlets, books, and whispered lectures turned these fragments into entire worlds of speculation. One author claimed the Templars had preserved secret maps of the Americas long before Columbus. Another tied them to Masonic lodges, saying that the Freemasons were simply Templars reborn in a new form, their rituals echoing those once practiced in Jerusalem's ruins. This blending of Freemasonry and Templar myth would prove especially potent. Across Europe and the Americas, Masonic lodges adopted Templar imagery, robes, and titles, presenting themselves as heirs to a line of wisdom that had survived fire and sword. For some, it was pageantry. For others, it was a declaration: we carry the flame that the Church tried to extinguish. But not all Templar myths were romantic. Some were sinister. In France, anti-Masonic propaganda weaponized the legend, portraying Freemasons as secret heirs of the Templars who plotted against throne and altar. Suddenly, the knights were no longer just tragic martyrs or wise magi. They were cast as shadowy architects of revolution, their legacy painted as a threat. This duality, Templars as heroes of hidden wisdom or villains of eternal conspiracy, was the fuel that propelled their story into the modern age. Every secret society, every government upheaval, every mysterious manuscript found in a dusty archive could be linked back to the order, if one squinted hard enough. By the time the century turned, the stage was set. The Templars were no longer just historical figures. They were a mirror in which every age could see its own fears and desires. And as the 20th century dawned, with its wars, dictatorships, and ideologies, that mirror would be used more aggressively than ever before. The 20th century brought with it technologies of destruction and ideologies of absolute certainty. Yet even in this age of tanks and telegraphs, the ghosts of the Templars continued to walk. Nationalist movements across Europe, searching for ancient roots to legitimize their ambitions, found fertile ground in the order's legend. In Portugal, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's Estado Novo regime cultivated a myth of the Templars as guardians of a glorious maritime destiny, tying the modern nation to the medieval knights who had once built castles along the Tagus and Douro. The order's transformation into the Order of Christ in the 14th century was resurrected as proof of continuity. Portugal's empire and exploration were not accidents of geography, but the unfolding of a Templar inheritance. Spain, too, flirted with these myths. Franco's regime invoked Christian warrior imagery, with echoes of the Templar as the ultimate militant monk defending faith against chaos. Across Europe, monuments were restored, myths revived, and knightly imagery woven into propaganda. But it was in Germany that the legend took on its darkest form. The Nazis, obsessed with occult symbology and the idea of an Aryan past, ransacked European myths to justify their empire. Within the SS, Himmler constructed a quasi-religion, borrowing freely from Templar ritual and aesthetics. At Wewelsburg Castle, his ideological fortress, the black sun insignia and candlelit halls mimicked what he imagined the Templars' secret chapters might have looked like. Himmler believed the Templars had once wielded secret power that the Church had suppressed. In his twisted imagination, the SS would become their heirs, disciplined, sworn to loyalty, wielding hidden knowledge. Yet what he built was not continuity, but parody. A hollow imitation that cloaked brutality in robes of mysticism. Meanwhile, outside fascist fantasies, popular culture was rediscovering the order. Early films and pulp novels portrayed the Templars as treasure keepers and shadowy survivors, guarding relics of Christendom or conspiring in hidden chambers. Even in comic strips, they became stock figures of mystery, waiting in ruins with swords drawn. In both extremes, dictatorships crafting ideologies and artists spinning adventure tales, the same paradox appeared. The Templars were always just out of reach, their real history half forgotten, their image endlessly reinvented. They could be saints or devils, martyrs or conspirators, guardians or tyrants, depending entirely on who held the pen. The century of extremes proved that the Templars had become something larger than life, not merely men of flesh and blood, but archetypes in the imagination of modernity. The Nazi fascination with the medieval world was not confined to banners and architecture. It extended into a fevered search for objects, relics that they believed could anchor their myth of destiny. The Templars, with their aura of secrecy and supposed treasures, were natural targets for this obsession. Teams of the Ahnenerbe, Himmler's pseudo-scientific research division, combed through castles, monasteries, and archives across Europe. They were looking for traces of the Holy Grail, for swords said to have belonged to Templar masters, even for maps that might lead to buried hordes in Iberia or the Middle East. They appropriated medieval artifacts and wrapped them in narratives of Aryan origin. At Montségur, the last Cathar stronghold, Nazi researchers lingered, convinced that the treasure of the heretics, sometimes conflated with the Templar myth, must lie hidden in its caves. In Portugal, they probed the symbols of the Order of Christ. In France, they speculated about Rennes-le-Château, weaving a web of Grail lore that still fuels conspiracy books today. None of this produced what they claimed to seek, but the very act of searching, broadcast in whispers and later in memoirs, deepened the aura of the Templar mystery. If one of the most powerful regimes of the 20th century had spent resources chasing their shadow, surely the Templars must have hidden something worth finding. After 1945, the ruins of the Reich left another legacy, a world hungry for conspiracies. The Cold War amplified it. Intelligence agencies on both sides trafficked in secrecy, and suddenly, the old myths felt new again. Stories circulated of the CIA and KGB scouring monasteries for Templar manuscripts, of Swiss vaults containing relics spirited away during the chaos of war. The fascination with hidden knowledge dovetailed neatly with nuclear-age paranoia. By the 1960s and 70s, these currents fed directly into popular books that blurred the line between research and imagination. Works like The Holy Blood and The Holy Grail gave the Templars starring roles in vast, speculative histories, tying them to Jesus' bloodline, to lost gospels, to networks stretching from Jerusalem to Scotland. Whether or not readers believed every word was beside the point. They had been reintroduced to the Templars as timeless guardians of secrets, and the legend flourished. It was the perfect setup for the digital age to come. On early forums and later across the internet, the Templars thrived as meme and myth alike, knights in shining armor for some, shadowy puppeteers for others. With every repost and every retelling, the gap between parchment history and popular legend grew wider. The Templars had become not just medieval knights or victims of papal politics, but a living code in the imagination of the modern world. When the first Templar charter was inked in the 12th century, its authors could never have imagined that 8 centuries later, their order would be reborn, not on parchment, not in the stone walls of fortresses, but in pixels glowing across millions of screens. The digital revolution reshaped how history was remembered. Suddenly, medieval archives once locked away in Paris or Lisbon could be scanned and accessed with a click. But just as often, the truth of the Templars became wrapped in the creative freedom of the internet. On message boards in the late 1990s, anonymous users spun theories. The Templars had survived in secret. They had safeguarded the Grail. They had buried codes in Masonic rituals. Each post, no matter how fanciful, added to the mythology. Video games amplified it. Assassin's Creed turned the Templars into archetypal villains, shadowy manipulators stretching from the Crusades into modern conspiracies. Millions of players walked through reconstructed streets of Acre, Jerusalem, or Paris, internalizing a version of Templar history that was equal parts digital architecture and storytelling. For many, this was their first encounter with the Order, not dusty scrolls, but cinematic battles and whispered plots. Films and television followed. From Hollywood blockbusters to late-night documentaries, the Templars became a cinematic shorthand for mystery. A stone cross in a dim cathedral? Templar. A locked vault beneath the Vatican? Templar. A coded map leading to America? Templar. Even when history was distorted, the image was irresistible. Knights in white cloaks with red crosses became visual icons of secrecy, a symbol audiences recognized instantly, even if the details blurred. But alongside the spectacle, the internet also made space for genuine research. Amateur historians began scanning charters, analyzing seals, debating translations. A teenager in Kansas could pore over the trial records of Jacques de Molay. A researcher in Tokyo could trace Templar property holdings through online archives. The democratization of history meant that for the first time since their suppression, the Templars' story was not controlled by monarchs, popes, or even universities. It belonged to anyone with curiosity and Wi-Fi. This democratization had its risks. Misinformation spread as quickly as fact, yet it also made the Templars more alive than ever. They were no longer confined to the margins of medieval chronicles. They existed in forums, fan art, and multiplayer battles. They became a shared cultural code, instantly recognizable, endlessly adaptable. In the digital age, the Templars had achieved what their founders once only dreamed of: permanence. They were now eternal not through castles or papal bulls, but through the endless retelling of their myth in the networks of a connected world. The digital age did more than resurrect the Templars as cultural icons. It reopened ancient questions. Every meme, video, or forum thread about the Order carried with it the echo of the very fears that had once doomed them. Secrecy, wealth, hidden agendas. These themes returned, now refracted through the lens of modern anxieties. Conspiracy communities thrived on this material. They spoke of the Templars not as men long dead, but as architects of ongoing schemes. Some claimed their descendants held keys to global finance. hidden vaults beneath Swiss banks, or secret influence within the Vatican. Others argued the order had morphed into new forms. The Freemasons, shadow governments, even elite corporations, with symbols echoing that crimson cross. It didn't matter that much of this was fantasy. The myth of the Templars was never bound by strict truth. Its power came from its ability to mirror the concerns of the age. In medieval France, they embodied fear of heresy and papal decline. In the Enlightenment, they were woven into tales of hidden wisdom. In the 21st century, they became metaphors for global mistrust, of institutions, of money, of unseen hands shaping the world. But even as conspiracy theories multiplied, serious scholarship also gained traction. Digitized records from the Vatican's Chinon parchment, released in 2007, showed Clement V had quietly absolved the Templars of heresy. For the first time, millions could read the very words once hidden in papal vaults, realizing that the knights had been victims of politics more than faith. The juxtaposition was striking. On one side, internet myths turned Templars into puppet masters of history. On the other, historians used the same tools to restore their humanity, brothers who prayed, fought, bled, and ultimately were betrayed. This duality is what makes their modern shadow so enduring. They are both villains and martyrs, symbols of oppression and symbols of freedom. They are whatever the age needs them to be. And in our era of uncertainty, when institutions inspire suspicion and power feels hidden behind curtains, the Templars fit perfectly into the cultural script. The irony is that the Templars themselves sought permanence in stone fortresses and papal privileges. They could never have imagined that their true immortality would be digital, not carved into marble, but into the shifting code of servers and screens. In this sense, the Templars have returned. Not as armies, not as orders, but as an idea too flexible, too powerful to die. It's strange, isn't it? A military order that dissolved over 7 centuries ago now appears on meditation apps, tarot decks, and New Age forums. The cross, once stitched on battle cloaks, is now printed on yoga mats and crystal pouches. At first glance, this seems absurd. But it reveals something important. The Templar story has slipped out of the historian's archive and into the language of personal identity. In the 1970s and 80s, when Western society turned toward mysticism and alternative spirituality, the Templars were rediscovered as more than warriors. Writers described them as guardians of hidden wisdom, custodians of truths suppressed by the Church, seekers who merged Christianity with older, even pagan traditions. None of this had clear evidence, but it filled a hunger. People wanted a myth that tied them to something both ancient and rebellious. Consider how many modern spiritual groups invoke the Templars. Neo-Templar movements, half fraternal and half religious, sprouted across Europe and America. Some wore robes and reenacted initiation ceremonies, swearing to continue the mission of protecting the holy. Others simply borrowed the imagery, the red cross, the white mantle, as symbols of purity, struggle, and faith outside of rigid institutions. Even more curious is how Templar myths influence personal transformation. You'll find self-help books drawing parallels between the knight's discipline and the modern search for purpose. Life coaches talk about Templar codes for living authentically. Spiritual YouTubers link the Templars to Atlantis, to sacred geometry, even to extraterrestrial wisdom. The lines between fact, fiction, and faith blur into one tapestry. Why the Templars, though, and not another medieval order? Perhaps because their story has the perfect shape: rise, glory, betrayal, and mystery. It mirrors the cycles of human life, It mirrors the story many people feel in their bones. Moments of triumph followed by sudden collapse, with a longing to believe that loss is not the end, that something secret survives. So today, the Templars live in rituals they never wrote, in prayers they never spoke, in philosophies they never practiced. And yet, in a way, that makes sense. The Templar myth has always been about filling silences. Where history leaves gaps, imagination plants seeds. In cathedrals they never built, in ceremonies they never performed. Their shadow has become a spiritual mirror for modern seekers. Whether this honors them or distorts them depends on how you look at it, but it proves one thing with certainty. The Templars, once feared for their secrecy, now belong to everyone who needs their symbol. If you've walked through a protest march in Europe or flipped through political posters in America, you may have noticed something unexpected. The Red Cross of the Templars, resurfacing in banners, patches, even tattoos. For centuries, it was a military emblem. Today, it has been claimed, reshaped, and reinterpreted in ways its medieval bearers could never have imagined. In some circles, the Templar cross appears as a badge of tradition, invoked by groups who claim to defend a Christian heritage against change. In others, it's reclaimed as a universal emblem of resistance, a reminder that once there were men who stood up to both king and pope and paid the price. The same symbol, two opposite meanings. This duality mirrors the order's own history. Were they defenders of pilgrims or secretive bankers? Saints or heretics? Heroes or conspirators? Because they occupied that in-between space, modern groups see in them a mirror for their own struggles. Some far-right movements have appropriated Templar imagery, draping themselves in crusader symbols to frame their cause as sacred. At the same time, progressive thinkers have written books and articles recasting the Templars as early victims of authoritarian power, martyrs of corruption, a medieval whistleblower case on a grand scale. But politics is not the only place the Templar shadow falls. Look at how often they surface in pop culture. In video games, the Templar is either a villainous conspiracy or a misunderstood guardian. In films, their ruins hide maps to treasures. Their secrecy fuels stories of bloodlines and lost gospels. Every retelling keeps the imagery alive, planting it deeper in the collective mind. And this cultural presence feeds back into the real world. A teenager who encounters a Templar knight in a game may later adopt the Red Cross as a symbol of personal strength. A writer inspired by the trials of 1307 may see in them a reflection of modern political betrayals. The cycle repeats. History inspires fiction, fiction reshapes history, and the symbol becomes larger than its source. What makes the Templars different from other orders, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, Benedictines, is not just their wealth or mystery. It is that their fall was so dramatic, so unjust, that their image became untethered. Anyone can claim them. Anyone can paint their cross onto a banner. They are a mirror that reflects whatever struggle you bring to it. So when you see the Templar cross at a rally, or etched into a ring, or glowing on a gamer's screen, you are not seeing medieval history alone. You are seeing a myth in motion, a living symbol, continually rewritten. The knights who were burned in Paris could never have known that their ashes would scatter so far, becoming sparks in arguments, stories, and dreams 7 centuries later. Their true legacy, perhaps, is not in what they built, but in what people still build upon them. Travel across Europe, and you will find them, not whole fortresses, but fragments. A tower crumbling into ivy. A chapel whose roof is gone but whose walls still hum with strange acoustics. a carved cross half buried in a farmer's field. These are the bones of the Templar world, scattered like fossils of a vanished species. And yet, for many who visit, the stones still speak. Pilgrims arrive not with swords or banners, but with cameras and notebooks. They touch the cold limestone blocks of a ruined commandery in Portugal, whispering as if the walls themselves are listening. In France, the Temple Church of Paris, once the order's beating heart, still stands tucked away in a quiet square. Its round nave carries the echo of chants long silenced, and its floor bears the effigies of knights who seem to sleep with their hands clasped on their swords. What makes these ruins more than just architecture is the aura of survival. Every stone feels like a survivor of betrayal, still standing in defiance of the king who ordered their destruction. Visitors often describe a sense of presence, as though the knights themselves never left, as though their watch continues, silent but unbroken. And people project their own stories into these ruins. A novelist sees a secret chamber hidden beneath the altar. A conspiracy theorist imagines that treasure once lay behind a collapsed wall. A historian reads the carvings, parsing dates and heraldry to track forgotten branches of the order. Each person finds something different because the ruins themselves are like a canvas left half-finished. Even the natural world conspires in the effect. Mist drapes the remains of English Templar preceptories in the early morning, making the stones appear like islands in a sea of fog. In Spain, the red cliffs of Monzon Fortress glow at sunset as if ignited by the past. In Scotland, Rosslyn Chapel, though built later, has become tied so deeply to Templar lore that its stonework is read like scripture, every spiral and symbol a potential map. The ruins endure not just as history, but as places of pilgrimage. Not official pilgrimages like Santiago de Compostela, but quiet, personal journeys. A traveler may walk through the broken arch of a Templar hall and feel that they have stepped into a threshold between worlds, past and present, fact and myth. The Templars may have been dissolved on parchment, but in these stones, they are never gone. And in the silence of their ruins, they seem to whisper the same question. What did we leave behind? And what are you still looking for? By the 19th century, the Templars had been claimed by more than mystics and occultists. They were now being drafted into the service of politics. Across Europe, where nations were being reborn or invented, the figure of the knight became a powerful symbol. The cross of the Templars, once branded as heretical, was dusted off and held aloft as proof of continuity, courage, and sacrifice. In France, writers resurrected the knights as martyrs of papal treachery and royal tyranny. To some, Jacques de Molay was a proto-revolutionary, standing unbroken before his judges and dying with defiance on his lips. To others, he was a nationalist before his time, a French hero destroyed by foreign intrigue. The Red Cross became a banner for liberty as much as for faith. In Germany, the Romantic movement painted the Templars in darker hues. They were imagined as fallen warriors, guardians of lost secrets, or tragic victims of corruption. Novelists and poets used their story as a mirror for the rise and fall of empires, a way of wrestling with Germany's own fractured past and uncertain future. Even further afield, in places where Catholicism had once held sway, the Templars became symbols of resistance. In Portugal, whose kings had transformed the remnants of the order into the Order of Christ, the connection was not a memory, but a living lineage. The great voyages of discovery, from Henry the Navigator to Vasco da Gama, were wrapped in Templar imagery, their sails still bearing the Crimson Cross. By the 19th century, as colonial empires were questioned and romanticized. This Templar heritage became a source of pride, linking explorers to holy warriors. But perhaps the most curious appropriation came in the form of secret societies that wrapped their nationalist goals in ritual cloaks. Fraternal orders, with ceremonies heavy on invented Templar language and symbolism, multiplied in Britain, France, and even the young United States. Their meetings invoked oaths of secrecy, swords, and banners, as if the very survival of the nation depended on a hidden lineage of guardians. For some, this was pageantry. For others, it was deadly serious. The Templars became less a medieval order and more a mirror, a way to project whatever ideals or grievances a society wanted to emphasize. They were martyrs for freedom, defenders of the faith, symbols of betrayal, or avatars of hidden destiny. The one certainty was that their story could not be left in the past. And as the 19th century bled into the 20th, the myth of the Templars would be drawn into even darker currents, where ideology and legend fused into something far more dangerous. The 20th century did not treat history gently. It was an age of propaganda, of symbols ripped from the past and rebranded to serve new masters. The Templars, with their striking imagery and dramatic fate, were irresistible. In Italy, Mussolini's regime looked to Rome's imperial past for legitimacy, but whispers of Templar valor found their way into nationalist speeches and veterans groups. In Germany, the fascination was even darker. Certain fringe thinkers in the occult-tinged Völkisch movement cast the Templars as guardians of a primal Aryan wisdom, destroyed by a jealous church. This was not history. It was mythology bent into service of ideology. But in an age when myth often mattered more than fact, the impact was profound. The irony was sharp. An order condemned for heresy by a medieval pope was now being painted as martyrs for new, twisted faiths. Pseudo-historians filled books with claims of secret rites, buried treasure, and bloodlines that tied the Knights to world destiny. Some of these tales were harmless escapism, feeding novels and pulp adventures. But others were used to justify exclusion, persecution, and the idea of a chosen elite destined to rule. Meanwhile, in quieter corners of the world, the Templar cross continued its gentler march. In Portugal and Brazil, the Red Cross of the Order of Christ adorned churches and flags, a symbol not of conspiracy, but of exploration. In charitable fraternities and Masonic rites, men donned cloaks and took oaths, imagining themselves part of a lineage that had survived centuries. To them, the Templars were not heretics or martyrs, but eternal guardians of moral duty. Yet the contrast was stark. On one side, the Templars as symbols of unity, charity, and brotherhood. On the other, their legacy twisted into the service of authoritarian regimes and racial mythologies. The Red Cross could be a light of hope or a shadow of fanaticism. As the century wore on, the extremes softened, but the fascination never faded. From comic books to Hollywood blockbusters, from esoteric lodges to nationalist rallies, the Templars were everywhere. Their story pliable, adaptable, endlessly reimagined. But underneath the noise, the same question lingered. Who were the real Knights Templar? Heroes, victims, heretics, or simply men whose story was too powerful to die? The answer, if there is one, lies not in the propaganda of the 20th century, but in the quiet traces left behind. The crumbling castles, the faded manuscripts, and the mysteries still sealed in archives. Centuries have passed since the last flames licked the body of Jacques de Molay, but the Templars never truly left us. Their castles stand as skeletons of stone. Their names survive in parish rolls, in forgotten seals, in whispered family legends. Their red cross, bold and simple, endures on banners, lodges, and even spacecraft, stitched into symbols of discovery and resilience. History tried to bury them. Kings condemned them. Popes erased them. But you and I, sitting here tonight, prove something remarkable. The story still breathes. Because stories this powerful refuse to die. Maybe the Templars were not keepers of an eternal bloodline. Maybe they never carried a lost gospel into the mountains of France or the New World. But their idea of duty, of secrecy, of power mixed with mystery has outlived empires, and perhaps that is the truest treasure of all. So when you hear the wind through a ruined cloister, or see a cross carved faintly into stone, remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember and what we dare to imagine. If this story stayed with you, if it stirred questions you didn't expect, let me ask you, what do you believe the Templars left behind? A treasure? A gospel? Or simply a warning? Drop your thoughts below. I'll be reading them. And if you'd like to keep walking with me into the shadows of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and ring that bell. It costs nothing, but it means this work can continue. And together, we can keep unearthing the stories that refuse to stay buried. Thank you for being here, across miles and hours, connected by curiosity. Until next time, rest well, and remember, the cross still whispers.